When maintenance worker Caleb Hart sat down at the lobby piano during the company Christmas party, he had no idea that one gentle lullaby would shatter the CEO's carefully constructed world. The melody, intimate, haunting, impossible, was supposed to have died 20 years ago with the boy who wrote it. But Vivian Ashford recognized every note, and the recognition broke something open inside her armored heart. How could a stranger know the song her first love had created just for her? And why did he vanish the moment she demanded answers? This is a story about secrets that refuse to stay buried, second chances written in music, and the courage it takes to choose truth over everything you've built on lies. If you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels, and stay until the end, because what begins with a simple song becomes so much more. The Christmas lights strung across the Ashford Industries lobby looked expensive, even by corporate standards. Thousands of tiny white bulbs wound through garlands so lush, it had to have been flown in from somewhere with better trees than the city could grow. Caleb Hart didn't know where exactly. That wasn't the kind of detail that mattered when you spent your days fixing broken elevator panels and replacing burnt-out fluorescents in stairwells nobody important ever used. What mattered tonight was keeping Maisie comfortable for another hour, maybe two, until the party upstairs wound down enough that he could slip out without anyone noticing. His daughter sat on the marble bench beside him, her small frame swimming in the red velvet dress her grandmother had sent 3 sizes too big, her eyes already heavy with the particular exhaustion of a 7-year-old who'd been promised an adventure and gotten a lot of standing around instead. "Dad?" she whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "You said there'd be cookies." "There are cookies, sweetheart. Upstairs." "But you said we weren't going upstairs." Caleb adjusted the strap of the canvas bag slung over his shoulder, the one with her pajamas, a coloring book, 3 different snacks he'd packed just in case, and the small first aid kit he carried everywhere since the incident at the playground last spring. Being a single parent meant planning for disasters that might never come, and still somehow missing the ones that did. "I said we'd see," he told her, which was the diplomatic answer he'd learned to give when the honest answer was too complicated. The honest answer was that he'd been invited to the Ashford Industries holiday party the way the help was always invited to these things. Technically included, practically invisible, expected to be grateful for the privilege of eating catered food in the building where they mopped floors. Maisie's lower lip pushed out, and Caleb felt his resolve wobbling. She didn't ask for much. She didn't complain when he picked her up late from after-school care or when dinner was scrambled eggs again because he'd forgotten to get groceries. She accepted the smallness of their life with a grace that made his chest tight every time he thought about it too hard. "Tell you what," he said, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "Give me 10 more minutes to make sure everything's locked up down here, and then we'll go up. Quick in, quick out. Cookies, maybe some of that fancy punch, and then home. Deal?" Her face lit up like he'd promised her Disney World. "Deal! But you stay close to me, okay? No wandering off." "I never wander off." "You wandered off at the grocery store last week, and I found you in the cereal aisle explaining photosynthesis to a very confused stock clerk." "That's not wandering. That's educating." She said it with the kind of conviction only possible when you were 7, and the world still made sense if you just explained it right. Caleb couldn't help smiling as he stood, taking her hand in his. The lobby was quiet this time of night, most of the daytime staff long gone, the building settling into its evening rhythms. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble, the kind of stone that cost more per square foot than he made in a month. He'd replaced a cracked tile near the elevators once and had to sign off on paperwork that made him sweat just reading the numbers. Everything in this building was expensive. Everything in this building was designed to remind you exactly where you stood in the hierarchy of worth. "Dad?" Maisie's voice pulled him back from thoughts that were too dark for Christmas Eve. "Why is there a piano in a lobby?" He followed her gaze to the corner where the old upright sat, half hidden behind a decorative column and a potted plant someone had strung with more lights. He'd forgotten it was there, or maybe he'd been trying to forget, the way you tried to forget things that reminded you of who you used to be before life took those possibilities away. "Decoration, probably," he said. "Makes the space look cultured." "Does it work?" "I don't know, baby." "Can you check?" There was something in her voice, not quite pleading, but close. That specific tone she used when she wanted something but was trying to be good about wanting it. Caleb glanced toward the elevators, then at his watch. They had time. Not much, but enough. "Sure," he said. "Let's take a look." The piano was older than he'd expected, the wood veneer dulled with age and neglect, the bench worn smooth by decades of people who'd sat here and touched these keys. He lifted the fallboard carefully, half expecting to find the strings disconnected or the hammers broken. But someone had kept it maintained, at least minimally. The keys were yellowed ivory, not the plastic replacements you saw in cheaper models, and when he pressed middle C, the note rang out clear and true. Something shifted in his chest. Not quite pain, but the memory of it. "It works!" Maisie clapped her hands together. "Play something." "Sweetheart, I don't—" "Please, just one song? You never play anymore." She didn't know why he never played anymore. She'd been too young to remember the before times, back when music was the center of his life instead of the ghost that haunted its edges. Too young to understand what it meant when someone's hand got crushed under a falling lighting rig during a production setup, when insurance companies and corporate lawyers decided that a contract worker's future was worth exactly one settlement check and a non-disclosure agreement. "Maisie, just one song, Dad. Please?" Her eyes were so wide, so full of hope that this small, impossible thing might happen. And Caleb was tired of denying her things, tired of being the parent who always said we can't afford it, or maybe next time, or I'm sorry, sweetheart, but no. Tired of the weight of everything they'd lost, everything he'd lost, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. "Okay," he heard himself say, "one song. But then we go upstairs and get those cookies, and then we go home. Agreed?" "Agreed!" He sat down at the bench and she scrambled up beside him, small and warm against his side. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of disuse, but not forgotten. His left hand found the bass notes easily enough. His right hand, the one that had been shattered and rebuilt with pins and screws and stubborn physical therapy, moved slower, more carefully. But it moved. He started with something simple, a children's song she'd recognized just to warm up the stiff fingers. Maisie hummed along, kicking her feet in a rhythm that was close enough to the beat. Then, without planning it, without thinking it through, he transitioned into something else. The melody came from somewhere deep and old, a place he'd locked away and tried to forget. It started soft, almost hesitant, a question posed in minor chords and gentle progressions. Then it built, layer by layer, the bass line steady as a heartbeat, while the right hand wove something fragile and fierce above it. It was the kind of music you felt in your bones before your brain caught up to name it, longing and loss and the strange, desperate hope that maybe, against all evidence, things could still turn out differently than they had. He'd written it half a lifetime ago, or started to. The beginning had come from someone else, a fragment of something pure and unfinished. But Caleb had taken those opening bars and built a world around them, a story told in arpeggios and suspended chords, in dynamics that swelled and faded like breathing. He'd never played it for anyone, never recorded it, never performed it. After the accident, after everything fell apart, he told himself the song didn't matter anymore. That part of his life was over. Music was something other people did, people with working hands and opportunities that hadn't been crushed along with bone and tendon. But the song remembered itself, and his hands remembered how to tell it. Caleb didn't notice when the lobby stopped being empty, didn't see the security guard pause in his rounds, head tilted like a dog hearing a frequency meant for other ears, didn't register when the catering staff setting up for the after-party stopped clattering dishes to listen, didn't feel the moment when the elevator doors opened and someone stepped out, drawn by music they thought they'd never hear again. He just played, eyes closed, Maisie leaning against his shoulder, the melody pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. Vivian Ashford had built her entire professional life on the principle of control. Control over her schedule, her appearance, her emotions, her company. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Ashford Industries' 70-year history, a fact that her father never let her forget, and her board of directors still hadn't quite forgiven. Every decision she made was calculated. Every word she spoke in public had been vetted by her own internal focus group of one, refined, until it conveyed exactly the message she intended and nothing more. So when she stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor and heard music rising from somewhere below, music that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Her first response was anger at her own reaction, at the way her carefully constructed composure cracked just enough to let something raw and aching seep through. She knew that melody, knew it the way you knew your own name, your own face in the mirror, knew it so completely that hearing it now, in this place, felt like a violation of some fundamental law of the universe. "Vivian?" Graham Klein appeared at her elbow, perfectly groomed in his designer suit, his smile the practiced expression of someone who'd learned early that appearance was everything. Her fiancé, her carefully chosen partner in a merger that made sense on every level except the ones that actually mattered. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I just need a moment." "The donors are starting to arrive. Your father wanted you to greet the Hendersons personally. They're considering a significant investment in the new—" "I said, I need a moment, Graham." She didn't wait for his response. Didn't care about the flicker of irritation that crossed his face, quickly smoothed back into that professional mask. She was already moving toward the stairs, toward the source of the music, her heels clicking out a staccato rhythm that echoed in the marble stairwell. The melody was clearer here, rising up through the atrium like smoke. It was being played on a piano, not a recording, not a memory, but live and immediate and real. Someone was playing it right now, in her building, on Christmas Eve, and the impossibility of that fact made her dizzy. She'd heard those opening bars exactly once in her life, 20 years ago, at a summer music camp her parents had sent her to because it looked good on college applications. She'd been 14 and restless, and so tired of being groomed for a future she hadn't chosen. And then she'd met a boy, quiet, intense, with dark eyes that saw more than they should, and he'd played her something he was working on. Just a fragment, he'd said. The beginning of something he wasn't sure how to finish. She'd fallen in love with the music first, and then with the boy who'd created it. A summer romance that felt enormous and world-ending the way only first loves can. They'd promised to stay in touch, to find each other again when they were older and freer, and able to choose their own lives. But 3 months after camp ended, she'd gotten a phone call. An accident. Quick and brutal and final. The boy who'd played her that melody was gone, and the fragment of music had died with him. Except it hadn't. Vivian reached the lobby level and pushed through the stairwell door. The space had been transformed for the party, lights everywhere, garland draped over every surface, tables set up for the catering staff who were now standing completely still, transfixed. And there, in the corner, partially hidden by a column and the glow of too many Christmas lights, was a man sitting at the lobby piano. He wasn't dressed for the party. Work pants and a simple sweater, the kind of clothes designed for function rather than style. Dark hair that needed cutting, stubble that suggested he'd stopped caring about maintaining appearances somewhere along the line. His eyes were closed, his whole body bent over the keys like he was having a conversation with them, asking them questions and listening for answers. And beside him, a little girl in a dress too big, leaning against his shoulder with complete trust. The music built towards something Vivian didn't recognize. The melody evolving past the fragment she remembered, growing more complex, more complete. Whoever this man was, he hadn't just learned the song. He'd finished it, taken those opening bars and built an entire composition around them, added layers and progressions that made the original fragment make sense in ways it never had before. It was beautiful. It was unbearable. Vivian's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her sides, willing herself back to calm, back to the controlled version of herself who didn't fall apart over a piece of music in a corporate lobby. But the control wouldn't come. The armor she wore so carefully had cracks in it, and the melody was seeping in through every gap, filling her with a grief she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself it had turned to stone. The song ended. The silence that followed felt loud, broken only by someone's phone buzzing and the distant sounds of the party ramping up on the floors above. The man at the piano opened his eyes, and they were dark and deep, and nothing like the eyes she remembered from that summer, but something in the way he held himself, the way his hands rested on the keys like they were precious and breakable, reminded her of, no, that was impossible. The boy from music camp was dead. This was someone else. Had to be someone else. But then how did he know the song? Vivian found herself moving forward before she'd decided to move, her heels loud on the marble, announcing her presence. The little girl noticed her first, eyes going wide at the sight of someone who clearly belonged to the world of the party upstairs. The expensive dress, the perfect hair, the authority that clung to Vivian like perfume. The man followed his daughter's gaze and saw her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition? Surprise? Fear? Before he shuttered it behind a polite, neutral expression that Vivian recognized all too well. It was the look people wore when they were bracing themselves for dismissal. "That song," Vivian said, and her voice came out rough, barely controlled. "Where did you learn it?" The man blinked, his hand moving protectively to his daughter's shoulder. It's just something I know. Old piece. I didn't think anyone would mind. Where did you learn it?" She heard how she sounded, imperious, demanding, every inch the CEO confronting someone who'd transgressed without permission. But she couldn't stop herself, couldn't dial it back. The song had ripped something open inside her, and she needed answers, needed them right now before she lost the fragile thread of composure keeping her standing. "Vivian?" Graham's voice cut through from behind her. "What are you doing down here? The Hendersons are waiting." She didn't turn around, couldn't take her eyes off the man at the piano, who was gathering up his daughter like he was preparing to run. "Not now, Graham. The party's upstairs. Whatever this is, I'm sure it can wait. I said not now." But the man was already standing, already pulling the little girl behind him. "We should go," he said quietly. "I'm sorry if we disturbed anyone. It won't happen again." "Wait." Vivian started forward, but Graham caught her arm. "Vivian, what is going on? Who is this person?" "Let go of me, Graham. You're making a scene. Whatever question you have can surely wait until after we've attended to our actual responsibilities." Vivian turned on him with a fury that surprised them both. "I said, let go." He dropped her arm like it had burned him, his expression cycling through shock to offense to a cold anger that would have intimidated her if she'd had any attention left to spare for his ego. But she didn't. She turned back to the piano. The man and his daughter were gone. She spun, scanning the lobby, but they'd vanished. Into a stairwell, maybe, or through one of the service corridors that networked through the building like hidden veins. Places she'd never had reason to learn, because executives didn't use those spaces. Executives used elevators and front doors and paths that had been cleared for them. "Where did they go?" she demanded of the security guard, who'd been watching the whole interaction with the wary expression of someone who knew better than to get involved in executive drama. "Who, ma'am?" "The man. The one playing piano." "Where did he go?" The guard's eyes slid sideways, a tell so obvious it might as well have been a neon sign. "I didn't see anyone, ma'am." He was lying. They were all lying. The guard, the catering staff who'd gone back to setting up tables like nothing had happened, probably even Graham, who was standing behind her radiating offense and confusion in equal measure. They were closing ranks, protecting one of their own from the woman who'd stormed down here making demands like some kind of tyrant, and maybe that's exactly what she was. Vivian pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. The song was still echoing in her head, every note sharp and clear as broken glass. It was impossible. All of this was impossible. But it had happened. She'd heard it. She wasn't losing her mind, was she? "Vivian," Graham said, his voice tight with forced patience. "We need to go back upstairs. Your father's going to ask questions if you're not there to greet—" "I don't care what my father asks." The words came out flat, exhausted. "I need to find out who that was." "Why?" "He's obviously nobody important, just someone from maintenance or janitorial who thought he could use company property without permission. If you want him disciplined, file a report with HR and they'll handle—" "This isn't about discipline. This is about—" She stopped, because how could she explain? How could she tell Graham about a summer 20 years ago? About a boy who'd died before they'd had a chance to become anything real? About a melody that shouldn't exist being played by a stranger in a corporate lobby on Christmas Eve? He wouldn't understand. He'd never understood the parts of her that didn't fit into the neat narrative of their relationship. The successful CEO and her equally successful partner, a power couple building an empire together. He didn't know about the girl she'd been before she learned to be Vivian Ashford, before she'd armored herself in ambition and control. Nobody knew that girl. She'd buried her so deep, even she'd almost forgotten. Until tonight. "I'm going to find out who he was," Vivian said quietly. "You can go back to the party, make my excuses, tell my father I had an emergency." "What kind of emergency? Vivian, you're not making any sense." She turned to face him fully for the first time since she'd heard the music. Really looked at him, the perfectly styled hair, the designer suit, the practiced expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. How long had they been engaged? 6 months? 8? Long enough that she should have felt something more than this dull fatigue when she looked at him. "The kind of emergency that's none of your business," she said. "Go back to the party, Graham. I'll be up when I'm ready." "This is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. Over what? A piano player? Someone who's probably not even supposed to be in the building after hours?" Something crystallized in that moment. Some understanding that had been building in the space between them for months, maybe longer. Graham didn't see her. He saw the position she held, the access she could provide, the image they created together. He'd probably never seen her, not really. And she'd chosen him anyway, because it was easier than being alone. Because a strategic partnership made more sense than risking the kind of vulnerability that came with actually loving someone. Because 20 years ago she'd learned that loving people meant losing them, and she'd decided it was safer to never love anyone that much again. "Go back to the party," she repeated. "Or don't. I don't particularly care either way." She walked away before he could respond, heading for the security office. If the guard wouldn't tell her who'd been playing piano, the sign-in logs would. Everyone who entered the building after hours had to badge in, leave a record. Paper trails were one thing corporations were good at, documenting every moment, every interaction, every person who moved through their spaces. Behind her, she heard Graham say something sharp and offended, but his footsteps retreated toward the elevators. Good. That was one problem she could deal with later, when she had the bandwidth to care about managing his ego and the fallout from whatever scene they'd just made. Right now, all she cared about was finding the man who'd played the impossible song, finding him and making him tell her the truth, even if the truth destroyed her. Caleb's hands were still trembling when he got Maisie into the car. She was chattering about the cookies they'd never gotten, about the pretty lady with the scary voice, about how much she'd liked hearing him play, and he was nodding along without hearing any of it. All his attention was focused on breathing, on keeping his heart rate somewhere south of cardiac arrest, on not letting his daughter see how badly he'd just screwed up. He'd played the song. After years of keeping it private, of guarding it like a secret that could detonate his entire life if anyone discovered it, he'd sat down at a piano in the lobby of Ashford Industries and played it where anyone could hear, where she could hear. Because of course that would be Vivian Ashford. Of course the woman who'd come down and demanded answers with fire in her eyes would be the girl he'd met at music camp a lifetime ago, the one who'd listened to those opening bars and understood them in a way that made his 14-year-old heart crack wide open. He'd recognized her immediately, even though 2 decades had turned her into someone both familiar and completely foreign. She'd been soft back then, open in a way that made you want to protect her, even though she'd have hated the implication that she needed protecting. Now she was all sharp edges and controlled fury, wrapped in expensive fabric and an authority that could freeze you where you stood. She'd grown into the person her family had been grooming her to become. And Caleb had... what? Grown into exactly the kind of person someone like her would look through without seeing. Maintenance worker, single dad, nobody important. Except she'd seen him. More than seen him, she'd heard the song and known it so completely that she'd come down ready to tear apart anyone who stood between her and answers. Dad? Maisie's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Are you okay? He looked at her in the rearview mirror, small and concerned in her too big dress. I'm fine, baby. Just tired. The pretty lady seemed mad. She wasn't mad at you. Was she mad at you? Caleb pulled out of the parking garage and into the cold December night. The streets were quiet. Most people already home with their families, wrapped up in whatever version of Christmas Eve made sense in their lives. He and Maisie would go home to their tiny apartment, and he'd tuck her in and read her a story, and she'd fall asleep believing in the magic of the season the way kids were supposed to. and he'd stay up wondering what he'd just set in motion by being stupid enough to play that song in public. "I don't know if she was mad," he said finally, "but I don't think we need to worry about it. We probably won't see her again." It was a lie. He could feel it even as the words left his mouth. Vivian Ashford hadn't looked at him like someone who'd forget and move on. She'd looked at him like someone who'd just found a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere in her carefully organized life, and she wasn't going to rest until she figured out where it belonged, which meant he needed to be very, very careful about what happened next. "Can we go back tomorrow?" Maisie asked. "I really wanted those cookies." Caleb smiled despite everything. "We'll get you cookies, sweetheart. Better cookies than they had at that party, I promise." "Okay." She yawned, the adrenaline of the evening finally giving way to exhaustion. "I liked hearing you play. You should play more." "Maybe," he said. "Your hands were shaking after, though. Did it hurt?" Sometimes he forgot how observant she was, how much she noticed even when she seemed absorbed in her own little world. "A little bit, but it's okay." "Was it worth it? The hurting?" Caleb thought about the question as he navigated the familiar route home, thought about the way the music had felt under his fingers, the way those old neural pathways had lit up like they'd been waiting all this time for him to remember who he used to be. Thought about Vivian's face when she'd heard the melody, the recognition there, the raw, aching need for answers. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think maybe it was." Maisie hummed something that might have been agreement, might have been the start of sleep. By the time they got home, she'd be out completely, and he'd carry her up the stairs and tuck her in without ever waking her. Tomorrow was Christmas, and she'd wake up excited about the presents under their small tree, the ones he'd scraped together from sales and careful budgeting. She wouldn't remember tonight as anything but a strange adventure with cookies that never materialized and a pretty lady with a scary voice. For her sake, Caleb hoped that's all it would ever be. But deep down, in the part of himself that still remembered what it felt like to want impossible things, he knew better. The song was out in the world now, and Vivian Ashford had heard it. Everything else was just a matter of time. Vivian didn't sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse office with the city lights spread out below her like a field of stars, the security logs open on her laptop, and a name that meant nothing staring back at her. Caleb Hart, Maintenance Level 2, Badge number 441. The records showed he'd worked for Ashford Industries for 3 years, clean employment file, no disciplinary actions, occasional commendations for staying late to fix emergency repairs. Before that, a gap in his work history stretching back almost a decade. Before the gap, and this was where her hands had started shaking, a brief stint as a production assistant at Meridian Stageworks. Meridian. The name hit her like a fist to the sternum. Her father's company had acquired Meridian 12 years ago, gutted it, absorbed the profitable contracts, and discarded everything else. She'd been in college then, too focused on her economics degree to pay attention to the business maneuvers happening in her family's empire. But she remembered the news coverage, the protests from theater workers who'd lost their jobs, the lawsuits that had been quietly settled behind closed doors. Vivian pulled up the archived files, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for hostile takeover negotiations. There had been an accident during the acquisition transition period. A lighting rig collapsed during a production setup. Multiple injuries. One worker in particular had been hospitalized for months. The name in the incident report was redacted, protected by the settlement agreement. But the timeline matched, the location matched. And when she cross-referenced the insurance claims with Caleb Hart's employment gap, the pieces fell together with a sickening clarity. Her father's company had destroyed this man's career, maybe his life. And then, years later, he'd ended up working in their building, fixing their elevators, invisible to everyone who mattered, including her. Vivian closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. The sun was starting to rise outside, Christmas morning breaking over the city in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if she'd had any capacity left to notice beauty. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently all night. Graham, her father, various board members wondering why she'd disappeared from the party. She'd ignored all of them. She needed to understand this, needed to know how Caleb Hart knew that melody, why he'd played it, What connection he had to the boy who'd written those opening bars 20 years ago at a music camp that felt like something from a different life entirely. The boy's name had been James Whitfield. She could still see his face if she closed her eyes, serious and sweet, with a shyness that made every smile feel like a gift. He'd played her that fragment of music on a worn upright piano in the camp's practice rooms, and she'd felt something crack open inside her chest. Some possibility she hadn't known existed. They'd spent 3 weeks together that summer, talking, laughing, stealing kisses in the woods behind the dormitories where the camp counselors couldn't see, making promises they'd believed absolutely, with the certainty of teenagers who thought their feelings were unique in all of human history. And then he died. A car accident on the drive home from camp. Quick and final, and so unfair, it had made her rage at a universe that would create something beautiful just to destroy it. She'd grieved alone, because her parents didn't know about James and wouldn't have considered a summer romance worth mourning anyway. She'd packed the grief down deep and built her life on top of it, layer by layer, until she'd almost convinced herself it had never happened at all. But the melody remembered, and somehow, impossibly, Caleb Hart knew it too. Vivian stood and walked to the window, watching the city wake up below her. Somewhere out there, Caleb was probably making Christmas breakfast for his daughter, wrapping presents, doing all the ordinary things that made up a life her family's company had derailed, whether he knew she was connected to that or not. She needed to talk to him, needed answers that the security files and incident reports couldn't provide. But she couldn't just show up at his apartment. That would be a violation of every professional boundary, an abuse of the access her position gave her. She'd already crossed enough lines last night, demanding answers like she had some right to them. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked at it. Graham. We need to talk about last night. That was completely unacceptable behavior in front of staff and donors. Call me when you're ready to discuss this rationally. She deleted the message without responding. Then she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Miles Rowan. Miles had been the music director at that summer camp, an aging jazz pianist who'd treated every gangly teenager like they were the next Coltrane. He'd mentored James, encouraged Vivian when she'd confessed she wasn't sure music was what she really wanted. He'd been kind in a world that wasn't particularly kind, and she'd lost touch with him the way you lost touch with everyone from a life you'd decided to leave behind. But musicians had long memories, and a quick search showed he was still teaching, still connected to the community. If anyone knew the truth about that melody, it would be Miles. She sent the text before she could second-guess herself. Miles, this is Vivian Ashford. We met at Hartwell Music Camp 20 years ago. I need to ask you about a piece of music. Can we talk? The response came faster than she'd expected. Vivian, of course I remember you. I'm at my studio all day tomorrow, the 26th. Come by any time. Would be good to see you after all these years. Tomorrow. She could wait one more day. She'd built an entire life on patience and strategic timing. One more day wouldn't kill her. Except it might, because the melody was still echoing in her head, and Caleb Hart's dark eyes haunted her every time she closed her own, and nothing about this felt strategic or patient or controlled. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, with no idea whether the ground beneath her feet was solid or just a comfortable illusion waiting to collapse. Maisie loved Christmas with the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that made Caleb's chest ache. She'd woken up at 6 in the morning, dragged him out of bed to see what Santa had brought, and spent the next hour playing with the modest pile of presents he'd managed to afford. A set of watercolor paints she'd been wanting, some books about space exploration, a stuffed penguin she immediately named Professor Waddles and declared her new best friend. She didn't notice that the apartment was too small, that the furniture was secondhand, that Christmas dinner would be spaghetti because he'd forgotten to buy a turkey and couldn't afford one anyway. She just noticed that her dad was there, present and attentive, building pillow forts and reading stories in funny voices and making her hot chocolate that was slightly too sweet because he always added extra marshmallows. This was what mattered. This was what he'd rebuilt his life around after everything fell apart, making sure Maisie had what she needed, even when he couldn't give her what she deserved. But his mind kept drifting back to the party, to Vivian's face when she'd heard the melody, to the way she'd looked at him like he'd stolen something precious from her, which in a way maybe he had. He'd never meant to finish James's song. It had happened accidentally, in the dark months after the accident when his hand was still in a cast and his future had collapsed into a black hole of medical bills and legal meetings and the slow realization that everything he'd worked for was gone. He'd been staying with his sister then, sleeping on her couch, and she'd had an old keyboard in the basement. Late one night, unable to sleep through the pain and the nightmares, he'd gone down and started playing with his left hand, the one that still worked properly. The opening bars of James's melody had come to him like a memory, something he'd heard at camp and carried with him all these years. He'd played it over and over, and eventually his right hand had joined in despite the pain, and the rest of the composition had poured out like it had been waiting inside him all along. He told himself it was therapy, just a way to process the grief and the rage at what had been taken from him. He'd never intended to share it, never thought anyone else would hear it, certainly never imagined he'd play it in front of the girl who'd loved the boy who wrote those opening bars. "Dad?" Maisie looked up from where she was painting a truly alarming purple sunset. "Why do you look sad?" "It's Christmas." Caleb forced a smile. "I'm not sad, sweetheart, just thinking." "About the pretty lady?" He should have known she'd remember. Maisie forgot nothing that mattered. "Sort of." "Was she your friend? From before?" Before. The word Maisie used for all the time that had existed before she was born, before her mom had left them, before their life had narrowed down to just the two of them against the world. "Not exactly," Caleb said carefully. "I knew someone she knew, a long time ago." "The person who wrote the song?" Sometimes her perceptiveness terrified him. "The beginning of the song, yeah. But you wrote the rest?" "I did." Maisie considered this, her paintbrush dripping purple onto the newspaper he'd spread across the floor. "So it's both of yours? Like sharing?" "I guess so." "Then maybe you should tell her that, so she's not confused." Out of the mouths of babes, Caleb pulled Maisie into a hug, careful not to disturb her painting. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You just don't always listen." He laughed, despite everything, despite the anxiety churning in his gut about what would happen when Vivian Ashford inevitably tracked him down. Because she would. He'd seen the determination in her eyes. The CEO who'd built an empire partly on never accepting obstacles she couldn't overcome. She'd find him. And then he'd have to explain things he'd spent years trying to forget. But for now, it was Christmas, and Maisie was happy, and Professor Waddles needed a crown made from construction paper. The rest could wait. The day after Christmas, Vivian drove to Miles Rowan's studio in a neighborhood she'd never had reason to visit. The kind of area where artists could still afford rent, where the buildings were old and beautiful in their decay, where the coffee shops had names like The Grind instead of artisanal branding. The studio was on the third floor of a converted warehouse, upstairs that creaked under her heels. She could hear music before she reached the door, someone practicing scales, another person working through what sounded like a Chopin nocturne. The door was propped open, and inside was organized chaos, music stands and instrument cases and walls covered in posters from concerts dating back decades. Miles Rowan looked exactly like she remembered, only more so. White hair wild around his face, reading glasses perched on his nose, the same cardigan he'd probably been wearing for 20 years. He looked up when she knocked, and his face split into a genuine smile. Vivian Ashford. "Look at you, all grown up and terrifying." She couldn't help smiling back. "I'm not terrifying." "You're wearing a suit that costs more than my car and you run a corporation. You're at least a little terrifying." He gestured to a chair that had sheet music piled on it. "Move that anywhere and sit down. Can I get you coffee? Fair warning, it's terrible." "I'm fine, thank you." She moved the music carefully, sat down, and suddenly had no idea where to start. How did you ask someone about a melody that shouldn't exist? How did you explain the way it had cracked you open? Miles saved her the trouble. "Your text mentioned a piece of music. I'm guessing this isn't about copyright law or royalty disputes." "No, it's about..." She took a breath. "Do you remember James Whitfield?" Something shifted in Miles's expression. Grief, maybe, or the kind of gentle sadness that came from remembering young people whose potential had been cut short. "Of course. Brilliant kid. That accident, such a waste." He played me something that summer. At camp. Just a fragment, the beginning of a composition he was working on. I remember. He was excited about it. Kept saying he had this idea but couldn't figure out where it wanted to go. 2 nights ago, I heard someone play that melody. Not just the fragment, the entire piece, completed. And I need to know how that's possible. Miles leaned back in his chair, regarding her with the kind of patient attention that had made him such a good teacher. Who was playing it? A man named Caleb Hart. He works at my company. Maintenance. I don't think he knew I was listening, and when I asked him about it, he ran. Caleb Hart. Miles said the name slowly, tasting it. Then his expression shifted to recognition. Oh. Oh, I see. You know him? I knew him, long time ago. He was at camp the same summer you were, actually. Quiet kid, talented but overshadowed by some of the flashier students. He and James became friends, bonded over being the serious musicians in a crowd of kids just there because their parents made them go. Vivian's mind was racing, rearranging puzzle pieces. He knew James? More than knew him. They were close that summer. Different styles. James was all classical training and discipline. Caleb was more intuitive, felt his way through music. But they pushed each other, challenged each other to be better. Then why? She stopped, because the answer was obvious. James died before he could finish the song, and Caleb finished it for him. I'd imagine so. James shared his work with very few people, but Caleb would have been one of them. And if anyone could have taken those opening bars and built something worthy around them, it would be someone who understood James's musical language. Vivian stood up, unable to sit still anymore. The studio suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. Why didn't he ever say anything? Why didn't he claim credit or publish it? Or maybe it was private. Maybe it was grief work. There are a lot of reasons someone might create something beautiful and then keep it to themselves. She thought about the security files, the accident report, the gap in Caleb's employment history, the way he'd looked at the piano like it was precious and painful all at once. He got hurt. Did you know that? Working for a production company. His hand was crushed. Miles's expression tightened. I didn't know. I lost touch with a lot of students after they left camp. Life gets busy, people move on. But that explains some things. What things? Why he never pursued music professionally. I remember thinking Caleb had real potential, the kind of raw talent that could go somewhere if he was willing to work for it. But talent isn't enough. You need opportunity, resources, luck. And sometimes you need not to have your hand crushed by a lighting rig. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Vivian didn't want to face. Her family's company had acquired the production house where Caleb worked. Her family's company had overseen the transition that led to that accident. She didn't know the details, didn't know if there had been negligence or just bad luck, but it didn't matter. The connection was there. Undeniable. I need to talk to him, she said quietly. Then talk to him. You're the CEO. You know where he works. I can't just... That's an abuse of power, using my position to corner an employee. Miles studied her with those patient, knowing eyes. Vivian, I've known you for exactly one summer 20 years ago, and approximately 15 minutes today. But I remember you as someone who cared more about truth than propriety. Has that changed? The question hit harder than it should have. Had she changed? Or had she just learned to hide the parts of herself that didn't fit the role she'd been groomed to play? I don't know, she admitted. We'll figure it out, because whoever you decide to be in the next few days is probably who you're going to be for the rest of your life. These moments matter more than we think they will. Vivian left the studio with more questions than answers, but at least now she knew the shape of the truth. Caleb Hart had known James, had finished James's song, had carried it with him all these years through an accident that destroyed his career, through whatever path had led him to working maintenance in the building owned by the family whose company had been responsible for that destruction. And she'd heard him play it, and something inside her had recognized not just the melody, but the grief woven through it, the loss made tangible in music. She sat in her car for a long time, watching the neighborhood move around her. People carrying groceries, walking dogs, living ordinary lives that didn't include corporate machinations or buried secrets or melodies that could rewrite history. Then she pulled out her phone and did something she'd never done before. She used her executive access to pull Caleb Hart's personal file, found his address, and entered it into her GPS. Miles was right. These moments mattered, and she was done letting fear make her decisions. Caleb was helping Maisie build a truly ambitious blanket fort when someone knocked on his apartment door. He almost didn't answer. They weren't expecting anyone, and unannounced visitors were usually either landlords or people trying to sell something he couldn't afford. But Maisie was already running to look through the peephole, and her excited voice called out, "Dad, it's the pretty lady from the party." His stomach dropped. Of course. Of course, Vivian Ashford would show up at his apartment 2 days after Christmas, because why would she respect boundaries or wait for him to reach out or handle this through any normal professional channel? "Maisie, go to your room for a minute, okay? But the fort? I'll help you finish it in a minute, I promise. Just give me some privacy to talk to this lady." Maisie pouted but obeyed, dragging Professor Waddles with her. Caleb took a breath, tried to compose himself, and opened the door. Vivian Ashford looked different outside the corporate context. Still expensive, that was inescapable, but softer somehow. Jeans and a cashmere sweater instead of the armor of a business suit. Hair down instead of pulled back. She looked younger, more like the girl he remembered from camp, except her eyes were harder now, eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. "Mr. Hart," she said formally, "I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I think we need to talk." "How did you get my address?" "Employee files." She had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I know it's an overreach. If you want to file a complaint, you'd be justified." He should slam the door in her face. Should tell her to go through proper channels, make an appointment, respect the massive power imbalance between them. Should protect himself and Maisie from whatever storm was about to break over their heads. Instead, he stepped back and let her in. The apartment was small and obviously cheap, but he'd made it as comfortable as he could. The secondhand furniture was clean, the walls decorated with Maisie's artwork, the blanket fort a monument to creative engineering. It was a life that worked on its own terms, even if those terms would be incomprehensible to someone who lived in a penthouse. Vivian stood in the middle of the living room like she wasn't sure what to do with herself. Her eyes landed on the keyboard in the corner, old and battered, with keys that stuck sometimes, but it was his, and it worked. "You still play," she said quietly. "Sometimes. When Maisie's asleep, and I can't." "The song you played at the party, I know where it came from. I talked to Miles Rowan." Caleb felt his defenses slamming into place. "Then you know I didn't steal it. James and I were friends. He shared his work with me. After he died, I needed to finish it. For him." "I'm not accusing you of theft." Vivian turned to face him fully. "I'm trying to understand how you knew him, how you ended up here, working for my company, playing a song that," her voice cracked slightly, "that I thought died with the boy who wrote it. You loved him." It wasn't a question. "I was 14. I loved the idea of him, the possibility of him. I loved what he represented. A life where I could choose music over business, passion over duty, and then he died, and I convinced myself it had been a childish fantasy anyway." Caleb sat down on the couch, suddenly exhausted. "He loved you too, talked about you constantly that last week of camp, had this whole plan to convince his parents to let him visit you, to find a way to make it work despite the distance." "I didn't know that." "Most people don't know how much they meant to someone until it's too late to tell them." Vivian sat down in the armchair across from him, perched on the edge like she might need to run at any moment. "Miles said you were talented, that you could have had a career in music. Maybe, we'll never know. Because of the accident." There it was. The thing he'd known they'd have to talk about eventually. "Because of the accident," he confirmed. "At Meridian Stageworks, the production company my father's corporation acquired." "Yes." "Was there negligence? Did someone fail to follow safety protocols?" Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Does it matter? Your family's lawyers made sure I signed an NDA as part of the settlement. I can't talk about the specifics even if I wanted to. I could make them void it. I'm the CEO now. I could..." "And then what?" He leaned forward, letting her see the anger he usually kept carefully controlled. "Sue a company you run? Drag both of us through a legal battle that would cost more than I'll make in my lifetime?" Prove that someone was at fault for an accident that happened 12 years ago? What would that actually accomplish, besides making you feel better about something you had no control over? Vivian flinched. I want to make this right. You can't make it right. What's done is done. I've made my peace with it. Have you? Because you're working maintenance in the building owned by the company that destroyed your career. That doesn't seem like peace. That seems like, I don't know what that seems like, but it's not peace. Caleb stood up, needing to move, needing distance. I work there because it's a job with benefits and reasonable hours that let me take care of my daughter. Because beggars can't be choosers, and I got tired of begging a long time ago. It's not some grand statement or punishment I'm inflicting on myself. It's just survival. I'm sorry. The words were quiet, but they sounded genuine. For what happened to you. For the fact that my family's company was involved. For all of it. Your apology doesn't change anything. I know, but I'm still sorry. They stood there in the shabby living room, the blanket fort sagging between them, and Caleb felt something shift. Not forgiveness, he wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready. But maybe recognition. That Vivian Ashford was more than her last name, more than her position, more than the polished armor she wore in public. She was someone who'd loved James too. Who'd carried the same grief, shaped differently by circumstance. Who'd heard the completed song and felt something crack open inside her, the same way he had every time he played it. Why did you really come here? He asked. Vivian met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her mask slipped completely. Because when I heard you play that song, it felt like finding something I thought was lost forever. And I needed to understand how that was possible. How you could take James's fragment and turn it into something so... She stopped, struggling for words. So completely true. It's what he would have wanted. The song, I mean. He always said music was supposed to tell the truth, even when people couldn't. He said that to me too. He said it to everyone. Kid was basically a philosopher in teenage form. Vivian smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look young and sad and hopeful all at once. I wish I'd known you both better, that summer. You were busy being the star student. We were the weird, serious kids who practiced when everyone else was at the lake. I wasn't the star student. I was the girl who had to be the star student because anything less would disappoint her parents. And now you're the CEO who has to be perfect because anything less would prove your father right about whatever doubts he has. The words hung in the air, sharp and true. Vivian looked away first. I should go, she said. Thank you for talking to me, for explaining about the song. Are you going to fire me? She turned back, genuinely shocked. What? No, why would I? Because I played company property without permission. Because I made a scene at the holiday party. Because this whole situation is uncomfortable, and the easiest solution would be to eliminate the source of discomfort. I'm not going to fire you, Caleb. And if anyone tries to, they'll have to go through me first. She meant it. He could hear it in her voice, see it in the set of her shoulders. Whatever else Vivian Ashford was, she wasn't someone who solved problems by crushing the people inconvenient enough to create them. Okay, he said. Then I'll see you at work. I suppose you will. She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. The song. Do you still play it? Regularly, I mean. Sometimes. When I need to remember that I used to be someone else. Would you... She stopped, started again. Would you play it for me sometime? The whole thing, beginning to end without interruption? It was a dangerous request. Intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with sharing something true. But he'd already crossed that line by playing it where she could hear. What was one more step into the unknown? Yeah, he said. I could do that. Vivian nodded, something like relief crossing her face, and left. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long time after she'd gone, listening to her footsteps fade down the stairs, trying to process what had just happened. Then Maisie's voice called out from her room. Is she gone? Can we finish the fort now? Yeah, baby, he called back. She's gone. Let's finish the fort. But as he helped Maisie drape blankets over chairs and secure the walls with clothespins, His mind was still on Vivian. On the way, she'd looked at his apartment like she was seeing a life she couldn't quite comprehend. On the apology in her voice when she talked about the accident. On the request to hear the song again, complete and uninterrupted. Something had started the night he played that melody in the lobby. Something that couldn't be taken back or ignored or filed away in the category of things that didn't matter. And despite every instinct that told him to run, to protect himself and Maisie from the complications that came with getting involved with someone like Vivian Ashford, he found himself wanting to see where it led, even if it destroyed him all over again, even if the cost was more than he could afford to pay. The week between Christmas and New Year's had always felt suspended to Vivian, like the corporate world was holding its breath before plunging back into the relentless machinery of quarterly reports and board meetings. Most of the executive floor was empty, key personnel scattered to vacation homes in Aspen or the Caribbean, leaving the building quieter than usual. She should have taken time off herself, should have been somewhere tropical with Graham, maintaining the appearance of a couple that actually functioned. Instead, she'd ended her engagement on New Year's Eve morning, standing in his immaculate downtown condo while he sputtered about optics and professional consequences and how she was making a terrible mistake. "This isn't a mistake," she'd told him, sliding the ring across his granite countertop. "This is the first honest decision I've made in months." "Honest? You're throwing away a perfectly good partnership because of what? Some maintenance worker who played a song? Do you understand how that sounds? It sounds like I'm choosing myself over a merger that was never a relationship to begin with." Graham's expression had cycled through disbelief to anger to something that looked almost like relief. Maybe he'd felt the strain too, the performance of being together without ever actually connecting. Maybe he'd been waiting for one of them to be brave enough to name it. "Your father is going to lose his mind," he'd said finally. "My father lost his mind when I was born female and inconvenient to his succession plans. This is just another Tuesday." She'd left before the conversation could become an argument, before Graham could try to negotiate or manipulate or do any of the things he was exceptionally good at in boardrooms. The ring sat on his counter, catching light, worth more than most people made in a year and meaning absolutely nothing. Now it was New Year's Day, and Vivian was in her office reviewing files she didn't need to review, trying not to think about the fact that she'd promised Caleb Hart she'd like to hear him play the song again. Trying not to wonder when that might happen, or if he'd even remember the offer, or what it meant that she wanted it so badly. Her phone buzzed. Her father's name appeared on the screen with the inevitability of a natural disaster. She answered. "Happy New Year to you too. Graham just called me." Richard Ashford's voice was cold even through the phone, each word precisely articulated. "He tells me you've ended your engagement. I assume this is some kind of negotiating tactic." "It's not a tactic, it's a fact." "Then you're a fool. That partnership made sense on every conceivable level, except the level where I'd have to spend the rest of my life with someone I don't love." "Love?" Her father said the word like it was a foreign concept, something quaint and outdated. "Your mother and I built a successful marriage on mutual respect and aligned interests. Love is what teenagers think matters before they learn how the world actually works." Vivian thought about her mother, elegant, distant, performing the role of Mrs. Richard Ashford with the precision of a professional actress. Had she been happy? Had she ever wanted something different? The questions had never been ones Vivian was allowed to ask. "I'm not Mother," she said quietly. "And I'm not you." "No, you're the CEO I made you. Don't forget that distinction." "You didn't make me anything. I earned this position." "You earned it because I gave you opportunities, because I groomed you for this. And now you're throwing it away over what? Sentiment? A crisis of conscience?" Graham said something about a maintenance worker. "Please tell me that's not what this is about." The urge to defend Caleb rose hot in her chest, but she forced it down. This wasn't about Caleb. This was about her choosing truth over performance, autonomy over approval, the possibility of something real over the safety of what was expected. "This is about me making my own decisions," she said, which, last I checked, is exactly what a CEO is supposed to do. "Don't be flippant. You want to run this company? Then act like it. Personal entanglements with staff, ending strategic partnerships on a whim, these are the actions of someone who's let emotion override judgment." or they're the actions of someone who's finally started listening to what she actually wants instead of performing for an audience that will never be satisfied anyway. The silence on the other end was sharp enough to cut. When her father spoke again, his voice carried a warning. "You're making enemies, Vivian. Board members who already question whether you're ready for this role. Investors who want stability, not drama. You keep this up, and I won't be able to protect you." "I don't remember asking for your protection." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt dangerously close to freedom. The ring was gone. Graham was gone. And for the first time in years, she had no idea what happened next. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a different number. Unknown, local area code. She almost didn't answer, then curiosity won out. "Vivian Ashford." "Ms. Ashford?" A man's voice, tentative and formal. "This is Caleb Hart. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "You're not. How did you get my personal number?" "Company directory. I probably shouldn't have called it directly, but I wasn't sure how else to reach you without it going through official channels." "It's fine. What can I do for you?" There was a pause, long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, "You asked if I'd play the song for you sometime. The whole thing. I was thinking, if you're not busy tonight, the building's pretty much empty. Probably the quietest it'll be all year. Good acoustics in the lobby without the usual crowd noise." Vivian looked at her desk, at the files she'd been pretending to review, at the life she'd been pretending to live. "What time?" 8? "After I get Maisie to bed. My sister can stay with her for a few hours." 8 works. I'll be there." "Okay, good. I'll see you then." He hung up before she could say anything else, and Vivian sat there holding her phone, feeling like she'd just agreed to something far more significant than listening to a piece of music. This was crossing a line, meeting an employee alone in an empty building for reasons that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the raw, aching need to understand the connection between the boy she'd loved 20 years ago and the man who'd somehow carried his legacy forward. She should cancel, should maintain professional boundaries, should recognize this for what it was, a complication she couldn't afford. Instead, she went home to her penthouse, changed into jeans and a sweater, and waited for the hours to pass like a teenager before prom. Caleb almost canceled 3 times. Once, while he was putting Maisie to bed, reading her the same story about dragons and brave princesses that she'd heard 100 times. Once, while his sister Emma was driving over, giving him a look that said she knew something was happening but wasn't going to push for details. And once standing outside the building at 7:45, keycard in hand, wondering what the hell he was doing. But then 8 o'clock arrived, and Vivian Ashford pulled up in a car that cost more than his annual salary, and it was too late to run. She looked different again, softer, more vulnerable without the armor of her professional wardrobe. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup, the kind of casual that probably still cost a fortune, but didn't advertise it quite so loudly. She walked toward him with her hands shoved in her coat pockets, and for a moment he could see the girl from music camp, shy and fierce, and trying so hard to be someone she wasn't sure she wanted to be. "Hi," she said. "Hi, thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me." They stood there in the cold January evening, breath misting in the air between them, until Caleb finally pulled out his keycard and unlocked the door. The building was dark except for the security lighting, silent in a way it never was during business hours. Their footsteps echoed on the marble as they crossed the lobby to where the piano waited like a patient witness to everything that was about to unfold. Caleb sat down at the bench without preamble. If he thought about this too much, he'd lose his nerve. Better to just play, to let the music speak the things he didn't know how to say. "It starts with James's fragment," he said, not looking at her. "The first 16 bars are his, exactly as he wrote them. Everything after is mine. I tried to stay true to what I thought he was reaching for, but I'm sure it's different than what he would have done if he'd lived to finish it himself." "I want to hear your version," Vivian said quietly. She'd settled into a chair near the piano, close enough to see his hands on the keys. Not what might have been. What actually is. Caleb nodded and placed his hands on the keys. The opening notes came soft and hesitant, James's voice speaking through time. Those first 16 bars were pure and simple, A question asked in melody form. What happens when you love something you're not supposed to want? What happens when duty and desire pull you in opposite directions? Then Caleb's composition took over, answering James's question with layers of complexity. The bass line deepened, providing foundation and heartbeat. The right hand wove counter-melodies that spoke of loss and longing, of dreams deferred and possibilities crushed. But there was something else in it too. Resilience, maybe. The stubborn refusal to let tragedy have the final word. The middle section built to something almost harsh, dissonant chords that made you lean forward because they were uncomfortable but compelling. This was where Caleb had poured all his rage about the accident, about watching his future collapse in real time, about learning that corporations could destroy lives and settle lawsuits and move on like nothing had happened. The music didn't shy away from that darkness. It lived in it, explored it, made you feel it in your bones. And then, gradually, it transformed. The harsh chords resolved into something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that you could carry grief and still move forward. That loss didn't have to define you even as it changed you irrevocably. The final section returned to James's original melody, but richer now, informed by everything that had come between. It was the same question asked with different knowledge, the same longing tempered by wisdom earned through suffering. And in the last 8 bars, Caleb had written an answer he thought James would have approved of. That love, real love, the kind worth fighting for, was worth the risk of loss, worth the pain when it ended, worth choosing over and over again despite knowing how much it could hurt. The final chord hung in the air, resonating in the empty lobby, and Caleb kept his hands on the keys until the sound faded completely into silence. Then he looked at Vivian. She was crying. Not dramatically, not making any sound, just tears sliding down her face like she didn't have the energy to stop them. She didn't wipe them away, didn't apologize, just sat there letting herself feel whatever the music had opened up inside her. That was... Her voice broke. She tried again. I've never heard anything that true. Caleb's throat felt tight. It's what he would have wanted, the truth, even when it hurts. It does hurt. But it's also beautiful. How did you learn to do that? To make pain into something that sounds like hope? I didn't have much choice. After the accident, it was either find a way to transform what happened or let it destroy me. Music was the only language I had that could hold both things at once, the grief and the survival. Vivian stood and walked closer until she was standing right beside the piano, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive. Close enough that if he reached out, he could touch her. I ended my engagement, she said abruptly. This morning. Graham's probably telling everyone it's because I've lost my mind. My father certainly thinks so. Caleb's pulse kicked up. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want there to be any confusion about why I'm here. It's not pity. It's not guilt about what my family's company did to you, even though I feel that too. It's because when I heard you play this song, something woke up inside me that I thought I'd buried 20 years ago. And I need to know if I'm alone in that or if you feel it too. The question hung between them, dangerous and honest, and requiring an answer that would change everything. Caleb could have lied, could have said this was just about James, about honoring an old friend's memory, could have maintained the professional distance that made sense given the massive power imbalance between them, could have protected himself and Maisie from the complications that came with getting involved with Vivian Ashford. But he'd spent years hiding, years playing it safe, years pretending that the person he'd been before the accident didn't matter anymore. And he was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of accepting scraps. Tired of letting fear make his decisions. You're not alone, he said quietly. I felt it too. Feel it. Every time I see you, every time you look at me like I'm someone worth seeing instead of just the guy who fixes the elevator. It terrifies me. But I feel it. Vivian exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. This is complicated. Catastrophically complicated. You work for my company. There are about 15 HR violations waiting to happen here. At least 15. My father will lose his mind. The board will use it as evidence that I'm not fit to lead. Graham will probably try to leverage it somehow. Your ex-fiancé sounds delightful. She laughed, surprising them both. He's actually not terrible, just wrong for me in every way that matters. Then why were you with him? Because it was easier than being alone. Because my parents approved. Because it looked good on paper and I'd convinced myself that was enough. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing the piano keys. But then you played this song and I remembered what it felt like to want something that didn't make sense. To choose passion over practicality. To risk everything for the possibility of something real. Caleb stood, bringing them face to face. She was taller than he'd expected, nearly matching his height. Her eyes were the color of slate, searching his face like she was trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. If we do this, whatever this is, it won't be easy, he said. People will talk. There'll be consequences. For both of us. But especially for you. I know. I have a daughter. She comes first, always. I won't let her get hurt by whatever happens between us. I wouldn't ask you to. And I can't promise you anything. I don't know what I have to offer someone like you. My life is small and complicated and nothing like what you're used to. Vivian reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. Someone like me. You keep saying that like you know who I am. But you don't. Nobody does. I've spent so long being who my father wanted, who the board expected, who Graham needed for his career plans, that I barely know myself anymore. Maybe your small, complicated life is exactly what I need to remember. Vivian, she kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a demand. But when he kissed her back, when his hands came up to cradle her face and pull her closer, it deepened into something that felt like falling and flying at the same time. She tasted like possibility and risk and the kind of reckless hope he'd thought he'd lost the capacity to feel. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We should probably talk about this, he said. Talking is overrated. I'm serious. If this is going to be anything more than a moment, we need ground rules, boundaries, some kind of plan for how to navigate the disaster this could become. Vivian pulled back just enough to look at him. You're right. You're absolutely right. We should be rational and careful and think through all the implications. She paused. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to be someone who kissed a man who played the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Can we have tonight before the complications start? It was a terrible idea. They both knew it. But Caleb found himself nodding anyway, pulling her close again, kissing her like they were teenagers at music camp, stealing moments before curfew. And for a few stolen hours in an empty building, surrounded by marble and silence and the lingering resonance of a song that had survived 20 years to bring them together, they let themselves believe that maybe, somehow, this impossible thing could work. Reality arrived at 7 in the morning when Caleb's phone rang with an unknown number. He answered groggily, having gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep after finally leaving the building at 2 in the morning, his lips still tingling from kissing Vivian goodbye in the parking garage. Mr. Hart? A woman's voice, professional and cold. This is Jennifer Morrison from Ashford Industries Human Resources. I need you to come to the main office at 9 this morning for a meeting regarding your employment status. He was instantly awake. What's this about? That will be discussed at the meeting. 9 o'clock. Don't be late. She hung up before he could ask anything else. Caleb stared at his phone, his stomach churning. This couldn't be coincidence. Someone had seen him and Vivian last night. Or someone had decided the maintenance worker who'd played piano at the Christmas party was a liability that needed to be eliminated. Or Graham had made good on whatever revenge he was planning. He called Vivian. She answered on the first ring. Caleb? What's wrong? HR just called. They want to see me at 9. About my employment status. What? No, I didn't authorize any. Hold on. He heard her typing, the click of a keyboard rapid and angry. I'm looking at the HR schedule. There's a meeting listed, but I wasn't copied on it. Who requested this? They didn't say. More typing, then a sharp intake of breath. My father. He flagged your file this morning and requested a review. That son of a... Vivian, what's happening? He's making a move. Trying to prove I'm compromised, that I can't be trusted to run the company if I'm getting involved with staff. He probably had someone watching the building, or he pulled security footage, or it doesn't matter how he knows. What matters is he's trying to use this against me. Caleb's mouth was dry. So what do I do? Come to the meeting. I'll be there too. And Caleb, don't agree to anything without me present, and don't sign anything. Do you understand? Yeah, I understand. This is my fault. I should have known he'd retaliate for ending things with Graham. I should have been more careful. We both should have been more careful. Caleb looked at the clock. He had 2 hours to get Maisie to school, shower, and prepare for whatever corporate nightmare was about to unfold. I'll see you at 9. Caleb? Whatever happens in that meeting, last night still mattered. This doesn't change that. He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that one perfect night could be worth whatever professional execution was waiting for him in the HR office. But he'd been here before, sitting across from lawyers and executives who held all the power while he held nothing, watching his future get reduced to a settlement check and a signature on a non-disclosure agreement. I'll see you at 9, he repeated, and hung up before his voice could betray how scared he actually was. The HR office was on the 15th floor, decorated in the aggressive neutrality of corporate spaces designed to strip away personality and leave only professional efficiency. Caleb arrived at 8:55, deliberately early, and was directed to a conference room by a receptionist who wouldn't meet his eyes. Inside, a woman in her 40s with severe glasses and a suit that could cut glass sat at the head of the table. Jennifer Morrison, presumably. And beside her, looking satisfied in a way that made Caleb's skin crawl, was Richard Ashford. Mr. Hart, Richard said pleasantly. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Where's Vivian? Ms. Ashford will not be joining us. This is a matter between you and the company's HR department. Her presence would be inappropriate given the circumstances. Jennifer Morrison opened a folder, her expression professionally blank. Mr. Hart, it's come to our attention that you may have violated several company policies regarding professional conduct and use of company property. Specifically, on Christmas Eve, you accessed the building's lobby piano without authorization, and more recently, you were observed on company premises after hours in what appeared to be a personal capacity rather than a work-related function. I had my access card. I'm allowed to be in the building. For work purposes. Not for personal meetings with executive staff. Richard leaned forward, his smile sharp as a knife. Let's not play games, Mr. Hart. You and my daughter were seen together last night, in an empty building, alone, for several hours. I'm sure you can understand how that might create concerns about professional boundaries and potential conflicts of interest. We weren't doing anything wrong. No? Then you won't mind explaining exactly what you were doing. Caleb felt trapped, caught between honesty that would confirm Richard's suspicions and lies that would only make things worse. I was playing music. Ms. Ashford asked to hear a particular piece, and I agreed to play it for her. That's all? That's all. Richard repeated the words mockingly. A maintenance worker and the CEO, alone in a building after midnight, and nothing inappropriate occurred. You'll forgive me if I find that difficult to believe. I don't care what you believe, it's the truth. Jennifer Morrison cleared her throat. Mr. Hart, given the circumstances, we think it's best if you take a voluntary leave of absence while we investigate these allegations. You'll continue to receive pay, but you won't be permitted on company premises until the investigation concludes. How long will that take? As long as necessary. This is retaliation, Caleb said flatly. Mr. Ashford doesn't like that his daughter ended her engagement, and he's taking it out on me. That's what this is really about. Richard's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. My personal feelings are irrelevant. What matters is maintaining the integrity and professional standards of this company. If you'd like to file a complaint about this process, you're welcome to do so through the appropriate channels. The appropriate channels. The same channels that had protected the company when his hand was crushed, when his career was destroyed, when his entire life was reduced to a settlement agreement and a non-disclosure clause. Caleb had been through this before. He knew how it ended. And if I refuse the leave of absence, then we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment for policy violations. The leave of absence is a courtesy, Mr. Hart. I suggest you take it. The door opened and Vivian strode in, fury radiating from every line of her body. This meeting is over. Jennifer Morrison stood. Ms. Ashford, your presence here is inappropriate. My presence is required. I'm the CEO of this company, and any personnel decisions require my approval. Did you get my approval for this meeting? Your father authorized. My father doesn't have the authority to authorize anything. I do, and I'm terminating this investigation immediately. Richard stood slowly, his expression thunderous. You're letting your personal feelings compromise your professional judgment. The board will hear about this. Good. I'll tell them myself. Along with the fact that you initiated a retaliatory investigation against an employee whose only crime was having a conversation with me. That's harassment, Dad. It's also illegal. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was waiting this long to stand up to you. Vivian turned to Jennifer Morrison. This investigation is closed. Mr. Hart returns to his regular duties immediately. Document that in whatever file you're building and make sure to include that this decision comes directly from me. Jennifer looked between Vivian and Richard, clearly calculating which Ashford to side with. Finally, she nodded. Yes, Ms. Ashford. I'll update the records. Good. Now get out, both of you. Richard didn't move. You think you've won something here? You've just handed me everything I need to prove you're unfit to lead this company. Then take it to the board. I'll be waiting. They stared at each other across the conference table. Two people who shared DNA but nothing else, locked in a battle that had probably been building since the day Vivian was born inconvenient and female. Finally, Richard walked out without another word, Jennifer scurrying after him. The door clicked shut, leaving Caleb and Vivian alone. Are you okay? She asked immediately. I should be asking you that. You just declared war on your own father. He declared war first. I'm just finally fighting back. She slumped into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Should have known he'd go after you to get to me. It's not your fault. It absolutely is. I pulled you into this mess. I put you in his crosshairs. Caleb sat down beside her. You didn't pull me into anything. I made my own choices, including last night. Last night was... She stopped, struggling for words. The best night I've had in years, and now it's cost you your job. I still have my job. You made sure of that. For now, but he's right. He has everything he needs to make my life hell with the board. They already doubt me. This just confirms their worst suspicions. So what do we do? Vivian looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw the same thing he'd felt since that first night at the piano. The recognition that they were standing at a crossroads, and whatever direction they chose would determine everything that came after. We tell the truth, she said finally. All of it. No more hiding, no more pretending. We lay it out for the board and let them decide if I'm fit to lead, despite having feelings for someone they don't think I should care about. That's a huge risk. Everything worth having is a huge risk. You taught me that. The song, the way you finished it, it's all about choosing truth over safety. Well, this is me choosing truth. Caleb took her hand, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Your father won't make this easy. My father hasn't made anything easy since I was born. But I'm done living in fear of disappointing him, done shaping my life around his approval. She squeezed his fingers. Are you with me? He thought about Maisie, about the small, safe life he'd built after everything fell apart. Thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea, all the ways it could explode in their faces. Thought about the power differential, the professional complications, the very real possibility that this would destroy both their careers. And then he thought about the way Vivian had looked when she heard him play the song, the way she'd kissed him in the empty lobby like she was coming home, the way she was looking at him now, not like he was the help or a problem to be managed, but like he was someone worth fighting for. Yeah, he said, I'm with you. Outside the conference room, Richard Ashford was probably already making calls, assembling his case, preparing to burn down everything his daughter had built. The board meeting would be brutal. The professional fallout would be severe. Nothing about this was going to be easy. But Caleb had learned something in the years since the accident shattered his hand and his dreams, that sometimes the only way forward was through the pain, through the fear, through the impossible complications that threatened to crush you. Sometimes you had to play the song even when it hurt. Sometimes you had to choose truth even when lies were safer. And sometimes, against all odds and all logic, you had to believe that love, Real love, the kind worth risking everything for, was worth the fight, even if it destroyed you in the trying. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which gave Richard Ashford exactly 5 days to build his case and Vivian exactly 5 days to prepare her defense. She spent those days buried in files, pulling together documentation of every decision she'd made as CEO, every successful quarter, every strategic move that had increased shareholder value. Numbers and facts and irrefutable evidence that she'd been good for this company, relationship with Caleb Hart notwithstanding. But numbers only mattered if the board was willing to look at them objectively, and Vivian knew her father well enough to understand that objectivity had left the building the moment she'd chosen her own life over his plans for it. On Monday night, her phone rang. Miles Rowan. "I heard through the grapevine that you're in some trouble," he said without preamble. The kind of trouble that involves boardrooms and family drama and probably a decent amount of corporate backstabbing. Your grapevine is well informed. Musicians talk, especially older musicians who've been around long enough to know everyone's business. You want to tell me what's really going on? Vivian found herself explaining everything. The song, the investigation, her father's retaliation, the choice she'd made to fight instead of hide. Miles listened without interrupting, the kind of patient attention that reminded her why she'd trusted him 20 years ago. "So you're going to war with your own father over a man you barely know," Miles said when she finished. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both." "Good. The best decisions usually are." He paused, and she heard papers rustling in the background. "I have something you should know about the song, about who really wrote what." Vivian's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "James wrote those opening bars, yes. Beautiful fragment, full of potential, but he showed it to maybe 3 people total, you, me, and Caleb. He was protective of his work, didn't like sharing until it was finished. After he died, I assumed the fragment died with him. But Caleb finished it." "Caleb did more than finish it. That boy took 16 bars of melody and built an entire composition around it that's better than anything James could have written alone. Not because James wasn't talented, he was brilliant, but because Caleb understood something James was still learning. That music isn't just about technical proficiency, it's about truth, about taking your pain and your joy and your whole messy human experience and translating it into something other people can feel in their bones." "I don't understand what you're telling me." "I'm telling you that song isn't James's legacy. It's Caleb's, and I have the documentation to prove it. Camp records, practice room logs. The fragment James submitted for his final evaluation versus the complete composition Caleb recorded and submitted to a scholarship competition years later. Before the accident, before everything fell apart, he was on track to study at Juilliard. Did you know that?" Vivian felt like she'd been punched. "No, he never mentioned—" "Of course he didn't. Because that future died when his hand got crushed, and talking about it would just be picking at a wound that never properly healed. But the music survived, and if your board wants evidence that Caleb Hart is someone worth fighting for, I can provide documentation that he's one of the most talented composers I've encountered in 40 years of teaching." "Miles, I can't use his music to defend my professional decisions. I'm not suggesting you use it as a defense. I'm suggesting you use it to reframe the narrative. Your father wants to paint this as a CEO having an inappropriate relationship with a maintenance worker. But what if it's actually a CEO recognizing exceptional talent that's been overlooked and undervalued? What if it's about correcting an injustice your family's company committed 12 years ago?" Vivian's mind was racing. "That's still complicated. The power differential, the conflict of interest, everything worth doing is complicated. But you asked me once, when you were 14 and trying to decide between music and business school, what I thought you should do. You remember what I told you? Follow the thing that scares you most, because fear means it matters." "Exactly. So what scares you more? Losing your position as CEO, or losing the chance to be with someone who makes you feel the way Caleb obviously does?" The answer should have been obvious. The CEO position was everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed to achieve. Losing it would mean admitting her father was right, that she couldn't handle the pressure, that choosing herself over duty was a mistake. But the thought of losing Caleb, of going back to the carefully controlled life she'd built where nothing touched her deeply enough to hurt, that scared her more than any boardroom battle. "I need to think about this," she said finally. Don't think too long. Sometimes the only way through is to stop calculating the odds and just jump. After Miles hung up, Vivian sat in her penthouse office staring at the city lights and thinking about jumps, about leaps of faith, about the distance between who she'd been groomed to become and who she might actually be if she stopped performing and started living. Her phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. Maisie wants to know if you'd like to come to dinner tomorrow night. No pressure. She's just been asking about the pretty lady who made her dad smile. Vivian looked at the message for a long time. Tomorrow night was the evening before the board meeting. She should be preparing, rehearsing her presentation, making sure every argument was airtight. Having dinner with Caleb and his daughter was the opposite of strategic. It was personal and messy, and exactly the kind of thing her father would use as evidence of her compromised judgment. She texted back, "I'd love to. What time?" Caleb's apartment looked different in the early evening light, less shabby and more lived in, full of the kind of comfortable chaos that came from actually using a space instead of just displaying it. Maisie had insisted on setting the table with mismatched plates and a centerpiece made from construction paper flowers, and she answered the door wearing an apron that was 3 sizes too big and covered in flour. "Dad's making spaghetti," she announced proudly. "And I made garlic bread, but some of it got burned, so we had to throw those pieces away and start over." "I'm sure it'll be delicious," Vivian said, charmed despite herself. "Are you really a CEO? Dad said that means you're in charge of the whole company." "That's right." "That sounds hard. Do you have to tell people what to do all the time?" "Sometimes." "I wouldn't like that. I prefer when people just do things because they want to, not because someone told them to." Maisie grabbed Vivian's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "Come see our fort. We added a new wing this weekend with a secret passage." The blanket fort had indeed grown, now occupying a significant portion of the living room and featuring architectural ambitions that defied structural logic. Caleb was in the kitchen, stirring sauce and looking flustered in the way of single parents who'd agreed to dinner guests before remembering they didn't actually know how to cook for anyone but a 7-year-old with limited culinary expectations. "It's just spaghetti," he said apologetically, "and the garlic bread is a little experimental." "It's perfect," Vivian said, and meant it. Dinner was chaotic and warm, and nothing like the carefully orchestrated meals she was used to. Maisie talked non-stop about her science project and her friend Sarah, who was definitely cheating at Foursquare, and how penguins could hold their breath for 20 minutes, which she knew because she'd read it in a book and books didn't lie. Caleb interjected when necessary, corrected obvious exaggerations, and looked at his daughter with the kind of love that made Vivian's chest tight. This was what she'd been missing. Not the chaos or the mismatched plates or the slightly burned garlic bread, though those things were nice too, but the genuine connection. The sense that everyone at this table was seen and valued for who they actually were, not what they could provide or what image they projected. After dinner, Maisie insisted on showing Vivian her room, which was an explosion of books and art supplies and stuffed animals with elaborate backstories. "That's Professor Waddles. He's a scientist. And that's Lady Fluffington. She's a retired spy. And that's George. He doesn't have a job because he's still figuring out what he wants to do with his life." "George sounds very thoughtful," Vivian said seriously. "He is. Dad says it's okay to not know what you want to be yet, that sometimes it takes a long time to figure out." Maisie climbed onto her bed, hugging Professor Waddles. "Do you like my dad?" The question was so direct it took Vivian's breath away. "Yes, I do." Like? The way people do in movies? "Maybe. Is that okay with you?" Maisie considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. "I think so. He's been sad for a long time. Not like crying sad, but like quiet sad. The kind where you can tell something hurts, but they don't want to talk about it. But when you came to dinner, he smiled different, like he forgot to be sad for a minute." Vivian felt tears prickling at her eyes. "Your dad is a very special person." "I know. That's why I want him to be happy. So if you can make him happy, then I think it's okay that you like him. But if you make him sad, I'll be very disappointed in you." "That's fair." "Okay, good. Now, do you want to see my rock collection? I have 17 different kinds, and I can tell you where each one came from." Vivian spent the next 20 minutes learning about rocks with an enthusiasm she didn't have to fake. And then Caleb appeared in the doorway announcing bedtime. Maisie protested but accepted the inevitable with reasonable grace, making Vivian promise to come back soon. "I will," Vivian said, and realized she meant it. Downstairs, she helped Caleb clean up the dinner dishes in a kitchen that was barely big enough for 2 people. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, passing plates and silverware in a rhythm that felt practiced despite them never having done this before. "She likes you," Caleb said finally. "Maisie, that's not... She doesn't warm up to people easily. But she likes you." I like her too. She's remarkable. She's opinionated and stubborn and has approximately 0 filter between her brain and her mouth. But yeah, she's pretty remarkable." He dried his hands on a dish towel, not quite looking at Vivian. "The board meeting is tomorrow." "I know. Are you ready?" "No, but I'm going anyway." "What if they side with your father? What if you lose everything you've worked for?" Vivian set down the plate she'd been washing and turned to face him. "Then I lose it, and I figure out what comes next. But at least I'll know I chose truth over performance. That has to count for something." Caleb reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers gentle. "You're braver than you think you are." "Or stupider." Miles said it's probably both. "Miles is a wise man." Caleb's hand lingered on her cheek. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know, this matters. You matter. Not because of your position or your family name or anything else. Just because of who you are when you're sitting at my kitchen table eating slightly burned garlic bread and learning about rocks from a 7-year-old. That person is worth fighting for." Vivian kissed him, soft and sweet and full of everything she didn't know how to say with words. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his shoulder and let herself have this moment of peace before the storm. "I should go," she said eventually. "Early meeting tomorrow and all." "Good luck. Not that you need it. You're going to walk in there and be brilliant and terrifying and make them remember exactly why they chose you as CEO in the first place." From your mouth to the board's ears. She left before she could lose her nerve, before she could let fear talk her into staying in this small, warm apartment where nothing could hurt her. Tomorrow would be brutal. Tomorrow would require every ounce of strength and strategic thinking she possessed. Tomorrow would determine whether she kept the position she'd sacrificed everything to achieve or lost it all for a relationship that had barely begun. But tonight, she'd had dinner with Caleb and Maisie. She'd learned about rocks and heard a 7-year-old's fierce protection of her father. She'd felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with her last name or her corporate title. And that, somehow, felt like winning. The boardroom was exactly as Vivian remembered. All dark wood and leather chairs and windows that looked out over the city like the people who sat here owned every building in view. 12 board members sat around the table, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to hostile to carefully neutral. Her father sat at the far end, looking satisfied in a way that made her stomach churn. Graham was there too, which Vivian hadn't expected. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod that might have been respect or might have been acknowledgement that they were both pawns in Richard Ashford's larger game. "Shall we begin?" Thomas Chen, the board chairman, looked tired. He'd probably spent the last week fielding calls from both sides, trying to navigate the politics of a family war playing out in corporate boardroom. "Ms. Ashford, your father has raised concerns about your recent conduct and judgment. He's asked the board to review your position as CEO. You'll have an opportunity to respond to those concerns." Richard stood, commanding the room with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for 40 years. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll be brief. My daughter has become romantically involved with a subordinate employee, a maintenance worker, to be specific. This represents a serious conflict of interest and calls into question her ability to maintain professional boundaries. When I attempted to address this through proper HR channels, she interfered with the investigation and used her position to protect this employee from consequences." He pulled up a slide showing security footage of Vivian and Caleb in the lobby, sitting at the piano. Another slide showing them leaving the building together at 2 in the morning. Another showing them entering her car in the parking garage. The images were damning, carefully selected to suggest impropriety even though nothing inappropriate had actually occurred. "Furthermore," Richard continued, Ashford recently ended her engagement to Graham Klein, a strategic partnership that would have benefited this company significantly. When questioned about her reasons, she cited personal feelings over professional considerations. This pattern of prioritizing emotion over business judgment is concerning. It suggests she's not ready for the pressures of this position. He sat down, and the room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Thomas looked at Vivian. "You have the floor." Vivian stood, her hands remarkably steady considering her heart was trying to break through her ribs. She'd spent 5 days preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, all her carefully rehearsed arguments felt hollow. The numbers and the strategy reports and the evidence of her successful tenure, none of it addressed what this was really about. So she decided to tell the truth instead. "My father is right," she said, and watched surprise flicker across several faces. "I did become involved with Caleb Hart. I did interfere with an investigation that I believed was retaliatory and unjust. I did end my engagement for personal reasons that had nothing to do with corporate strategy. All of those things are true." Richard looked smug. Graham looked pained. Thomas looked resigned. "What my father didn't tell you," Vivian continued, "is why any of those things happened. Caleb Hart isn't just a maintenance worker. He's a classically trained musician who was on track to study at Juilliard before an accident at a production company. A company this corporation acquired, destroyed his hand and his career 12 years ago." She pulled up her own slides now, documentation Miles had provided. Practice room logs from music camp, the scholarship application, letters of recommendation from instructors who'd recognized Caleb's talent, medical records from the accident showing the extent of his injuries. The accident occurred during the transition period after Ashford Industries acquired Meridian Stageworks. There were safety violations, inadequate supervision, cost-cutting measures that put workers at risk. Caleb Hart lost his career because this company, our company, prioritized profit over people. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. This was ancient history to them, a minor acquisition that had happened over a decade ago. But seeing it laid out like this, seeing the human cost of decisions made in rooms exactly like this one, made it impossible to ignore. "I didn't know any of this when I met Caleb," Vivian said. "I only knew that he played a piece of music that meant something to me. A song written by someone I cared about 20 years ago, someone who died before he could finish it. Caleb finished it, took a fragment, and built something beautiful and true around it. And yes, that mattered to me. It made me see him as more than his job title. Made me see myself as more than mine." "This is very touching," Richard interrupted, "but it doesn't address the fundamental conflict of interest." "Let her finish," Thomas said sharply. Vivian took a breath. "You want to know about judgment? About the ability to make hard decisions under pressure? Let me tell you what I've learned about judgment in the last week. It's not about following the safe path or maintaining appearances or doing what's expected. It's about looking at a situation clearly and making the choice that aligns with your values, even when that choice costs you everything." She looked directly at her father. "You taught me that business is war, that you win by being smarter, more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice than your opponents. And I've been a good student. I've made the hard calls, closed the deals, eliminated the weaknesses. I've been exactly the CEO you groomed me to be." "Then why are you throwing it away?" Richard demanded. "Because being the CEO you groomed me to be means becoming someone I don't recognize when I look in the mirror. Someone who values image over integrity. Someone who sees people like Caleb Hart as collateral damage instead of human beings deserving of dignity and opportunity. And I'm done being that person." The room was absolutely silent. "So yes," Vivian continued, "I'm involved with someone you think is inappropriate. Yes, I prioritize personal feelings over a strategic engagement. Yes, I interfered with an investigation I believed was unjust. And if those actions mean I'm not fit to be CEO, then vote me out. But don't pretend this is about professional judgment. This is about control. About whether I'm going to live my life according to my father's plans or my own." She sat down, her legs shaking with adrenaline. Thomas looked around the table. "Does anyone have questions for Ms. Ashford?" Margaret Williams, one of the older board members, raised her hand. "Have you considered the optics of this relationship? How it will be perceived by shareholders and the media?" "I have. And I think the optics of a CEO who recognizes talent regardless of job title and takes responsibility for past corporate failures are actually pretty good. But I'm not going to lie and say optics are my primary concern. They're not. What is your primary concern? Another board member asked. Running this company with integrity, making sure that 15 years from now, when people look back at decisions we made in this room, they can be proud of them instead of ashamed. That includes how we treat our employees, all of our employees, not just the ones at the executive level. Graham spoke up for the first time. For what it's worth, Vivian's right about the engagement. It was strategic, not romantic. She had the courage to end it when it became clear neither of us was happy. That's not poor judgment, that's honesty. He looked at Richard. Something this family could use more of. Richard's face went red. You're out of line. No, you're out of line, Graham said calmly. I went along with your plan to use this relationship as evidence of Vivian's incompetence because I was angry about being rejected. But sitting here watching you try to destroy your own daughter's career because she dared to choose her own life? That's not business. That's cruelty. Thomas called for a brief recess, and the board members filed out to discuss in private. Vivian stood alone at the window, watching the city below and trying to steady her breathing. That was either very brave or very stupid, a voice said behind her. She turned to find Graham standing there, hands in his pockets. Miles Rowan said the same thing. Miles Rowan is wise. Listen, I'm sorry for going along with your father's plan, for not speaking up sooner. You spoke up when it mattered. That's what counts. Do you love him, the musician? Vivian considered the question honestly. I don't know yet, but I could, and that possibility feels more real than anything I've felt in years, including what I felt for you. I know. I felt it too. Graham smiled sadly. Go be happy, Vivian. You deserve it, even if it costs you this job. Thanks, Graham. The board filed back in 15 minutes later. Thomas looked grave, which could mean anything. We've discussed the situation, he said, and we've reached a decision. Ms. Ashford, your conduct has been unorthodox and has raised legitimate concerns about professional boundaries. However, your track record as CEO is exemplary. You've increased shareholder value by 30%, successfully navigated 3 major acquisitions, and maintained strong relationships with key stakeholders. Vivian held her breath. That said, we can't simply ignore the conflict of interest your relationship with Mr. Hart presents. Therefore, we're implementing new policies regarding relationships between executives and employees. Full disclosure will be required, and an independent ethics board will review such situations to ensure there's no abuse of power. Ms. Ashford, you'll be required to recuse yourself from any decisions directly affecting Mr. Hart's employment. Are those terms acceptable? Yes, absolutely. Then you'll remain as CEO. But Vivian, Thomas looked at her seriously. You're on notice. Another controversy like this, another situation that calls your judgment into question, and we'll revisit this decision. Am I clear? Crystal clear. Richard stood abruptly. This is unacceptable. You're rewarding her for flouting company policy. Richard, you've had your say. Thomas's voice was steel. The board has voted 7-5 in favor of keeping Vivian as CEO. You're outvoted. Then I'm resigning from the board. I will not be part of this circus. That's your choice. We'll accept your resignation effective immediately. Richard looked at Vivian with something like hatred, and she looked back without flinching. This was it. The final break. The moment when she stopped being his daughter in any meaningful sense and became simply another person he'd failed to control. You'll regret this, he said quietly. All of you. He walked out without another word, and the door closing behind him sounded like the end of an era. Thomas adjourned the meeting, and board members filed out, some offering Vivian congratulations, others avoiding eye contact. She stood there feeling hollowed out and filled up at the same time, like she'd survived something that should have killed her and wasn't quite sure what to do with being alive. Her phone buzzed. Caleb. How did it go? She texted back, I still have a job, and my father resigned from the board. That's good, right? That's complicated. Can I see you tonight? Always. Vivian left the boardroom and took the elevator down to the lobby. The piano sat in its corner, patient as ever, and she found herself walking toward it. The building was mostly empty, the workday winding down, and when she sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard, No one was around to tell her she shouldn't. She played the first 16 bars of James's melody, the only part she remembered clearly. Her technique was rusty, her fingers stumbling over chord changes she'd once known by heart. But the music was still there, waiting underneath the years of neglect. The elevator chimed and Caleb stepped out, still in his work clothes, looking worried until he saw her sitting at the piano. Then his expression softened into something that made her heart skip. "You played," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Just the beginning. I don't remember the rest. I could teach you, if you wanted. I'd like that." Caleb sat down beside her on the bench, their shoulders touching. "You really kept your job?" "I really did, though I suspect the next few months will be brutal. My father will find ways to make my life difficult, and the board will be watching for any misstep. So what you're saying is we should probably keep things quiet for a while. Professional. No more late-night piano sessions." Vivian turned to look at him. "Actually, what I'm saying is that I'm done hiding. I fought for this, for the right to choose my own life, and if I immediately go back to pretending and performing, then what was the point? The point is keeping your job, not risking everything we just won. We won the right to be honest, Caleb, not the right to be comfortable." She took his hand. "I'm not asking you to be reckless. I'm just asking you to be real. To let this, whatever this is between us, exist in daylight instead of shadows." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Vivian could see him calculating risks, weighing consequences, trying to protect both of them from the complications ahead. Then he smiled, and it was the real smile Maisie had talked about, the one that forgot to be sad. "Okay," he said, "daylight it is." He kissed her there in the lobby where anyone could see, and Vivian kissed him back without worrying about security cameras or board members or her father's inevitable retaliation. For the first time in her adult life, she was choosing what she wanted over what was expected. And if that made her a fool, then at least she was an honest one. The song had brought them together. James's fragment finished by Caleb's grief and talent, played in a moment of vulnerability and heard by someone who understood its weight. But what came next was theirs to write. No ghost melodies or borrowed legacies, just two people choosing each other despite the odds. And that, Vivian thought, as Caleb's hand found hers, was a beginning worth fighting for. The retaliation started 3 days after the board meeting, not with anything as obvious as another investigation or a direct attack, but with the kind of subtle corporate warfare Richard Ashford had perfected over 40 years in business. Leaked emails to financial journalists questioning Vivian's leadership decisions. Anonymous tips to gossip columns about the CEO's inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. Quiet conversations with major investors suggesting that perhaps Ashford Industries needed more experienced guidance. Vivian had expected this. What she hadn't expected was how vicious it would get. How quickly the narrative would twist from a CEO making her own choices to a woman too emotional to handle the pressures of leadership. The headlines were brutal, the opinion pieces worse, and by the end of the first week, her approval rating among shareholders had dropped 12 points. "You could fix this," Thomas Chen told her during an emergency call. "Public statement, clarify that the relationship ended, that you've recommitted to keeping your personal and professional lives separate. Give them the reassurance they're looking for." "You mean lie?" "I mean manage the situation before it becomes unmanageable." Vivian looked out her office window at the city below, thinking about all the ways she could make this easier. End things with Caleb before they'd really begun. Claim it had been a lapse in judgment, quickly corrected. Go back to being the CEO everyone expected her to be, cold, controlled, married to the job in every way that mattered. "No," she said. "I'm not lying about this. If the shareholders want me out because I'm in a relationship with someone they don't approve of, then that's their choice. But I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not just to keep them comfortable." Thomas sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally making it as honest as it should have been all along." She hung up and immediately called Caleb. He answered on the second ring, and she could hear Maisie singing something in the background about dinosaurs and breakfast cereal. "Hey," he said, and just the warmth in his voice made some of the tension in her shoulders ease. "How's the war going?" "We're losing. The press is eating me alive, the shareholders are getting nervous, and I have 3 board members who've started making noises about calling another review meeting. So, standard Tuesday in the corporate world. Despite everything, she laughed. How are you so calm about this? Because I've already lost everything once. This time, even if it all falls apart, I've got something worth fighting for. That makes all the difference. Vivian felt tears prickling at her eyes. I'm dragging you through hell with me. Good thing I'm getting used to the heat. He paused. Listen, Maisie and I are making pancakes that are probably going to be terrible because she insists on adding chocolate chips and bananas, and I think I saw her eyeing the gummy bears. Come have breakfast with us. The world can wait an hour. I have a 9 o'clock with the legal team. Vivian, come have terrible pancakes with us. Please. She looked at her calendar, at the meetings stacked back to back, at the careful choreography of a day designed to prove she could handle the pressure. Then she thought about Maisie's construction paper flowers and Caleb's rare, real smiles and the way it felt to be in that small, warm apartment where her last name didn't matter. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The pancakes were indeed terrible, too sweet, structurally unsound, and featuring ingredients that should never appear together in any food item. Maisie declared them a triumph of culinary innovation. Caleb apologized profusely while scraping burned batter off the pan. And Vivian ate 3 of them while listening to Maisie explain her theory that dinosaurs probably would have loved pancakes if they'd had the chance to try them. It was the best breakfast she'd had in months. Dad says people are being mean to you because of us, Maisie said suddenly, her face serious. Is that true? Vivian looked at Caleb, who mouthed sorry and looked helpless. Some people are saying unkind things, yes, but that's not because of you. It's because they don't understand that sometimes the rules people make don't account for real life being complicated. Are you sad about it? Sometimes. But I'm also happy about other things, like getting to eat experimental pancakes with you. Maisie considered this. Sarah's mom says you should follow your heart even when it's scary. She said that when Sarah wanted to quit piano but didn't want to disappoint her teacher. Do you think that's true? I think Sarah's mom is very wise. Good. Because I think you should keep following your heart, even if people are mean about it. Because my dad's happy now, and that matters more than what mean people think. Vivian felt something crack open in her chest, the kind of emotional honesty that only children could deliver without artifice or agenda. Thank you, Maisie. That really helps. After breakfast, while Maisie was getting ready for school, Caleb walked Vivian to her car. The morning was cold and crisp, the kind of January day that made you believe in fresh starts even when everything else suggested otherwise. She's not wrong, you know, Caleb said, about following your heart, though I'm biased since I'm the beneficiary of you doing exactly that. Your daughter is remarkable. She gets it from her mother. He said it casually, but Vivian caught the flash of old pain. He'd never talked much about Maisie's mom, just mentioned in passing that she'd left when Maisie was 2, that it had been just the 2 of them ever since. Do you want to talk about her? Your ex? Caleb leaned against the car, hands in his pockets. Not much to tell. We were young, broke, both dealing with trauma we didn't have the tools to process. The accident, the medical bills, the destroyed career, it was too much. She stayed as long as she could, and then she couldn't anymore. I don't blame her for leaving. I just wish she'd stayed in touch with Maisie, but that ship sailed a long time ago. I'm sorry. Don't be. If she'd stayed, we would have made each other miserable trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is admit when something isn't working and let it end. He looked at her seriously. Which is why I need to ask, is this working? Because if the cost is too high, if keeping me around is going to destroy everything you've built, then maybe we need to— Don't. Vivian grabbed his hand. Don't finish that sentence. Yes, this is hard. Yes, there are costs I didn't fully anticipate. But you asked if it's working, and the answer is yes. Being with you, being part of this— She gestured at the apartment building, at the life he'd built with Maisie. This is the first thing that's felt real in longer than I can remember. So please don't ask me to give it up to make things easier. Caleb pulled her close, and she buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pancake batter and laundry detergent and home. Okay, he said quietly. Then we fight. Together. Together, she agreed. But fighting together turned out to be more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The media storm intensified, with photographers camping outside Caleb's apartment building and Vivian's penthouse, looking for shots they could use to craft whatever narrative sold papers. Maisie started having nightmares about strangers with cameras. Caleb got calls from lawyers claiming to represent his interests, but actually fishing for information they could sell. And Vivian watched her approval ratings continue to slide as the board members who'd voted to keep her started questioning that decision. 2 weeks after the board meeting, things came to a head. Richard Ashford gave an interview to a major business publication, carefully worded to avoid legal liability but devastating in its implications. He talked about the challenges of grooming a successor who wasn't ready for the pressures of leadership, about difficult decisions made to protect shareholder value, about the importance of maintaining professional standards even when personal feelings complicated matters. He never mentioned Vivian by name. He didn't have to. The article ran on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, 3 major investors had called emergency meetings to discuss concerns about current leadership. By Thursday evening, Graham Klein showed up at Vivian's office unannounced. "You look terrible," he said bluntly. "Thank you, that's exactly what I needed to hear right now." "I'm serious. When's the last time you slept? Ate something that wasn't coffee?" Vivian tried to remember and couldn't. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground trying to prove you can handle this, and it's not working. The harder you fight, the more they see someone who's in over her head. So what am I supposed to do? Give up? Let my father win? No, you're supposed to change the game." Graham sat down across from her desk. "Your father is playing the long game. Death by 1,000 cuts, destroying your credibility piece by piece until the board has no choice but to remove you. You can't win that game playing defense. You need to go on offense." "I'm listening." "The original accident, the one that injured Caleb, your father's company was responsible, and they covered it up with settlements and NDAs. What if you uncovered that? What if you made it public that Ashford Industries has been hiding safety violations and worker injuries for years?" Vivian stared at him. "That would be corporate suicide. The lawsuits alone would be expensive, yes, but they'd also position you as a CEO willing to take responsibility for past wrongs. Someone who prioritizes ethics over image. And it would completely destroy your father's credibility. Hard to claim the moral high ground when your own corporate malfeasance is being exposed." "Why are you helping me?" Graham smiled sadly. "Because I spent 2 years pretending to be in love with you, and you were never anything but kind to me, even though you must have known it was all performance. You deserve better than being torn apart by your own father for the crime of choosing to be happy. And besides, your father used me too. I'm not inclined to let that go unanswered." Vivian thought about what Graham was suggesting. It was risky, potentially catastrophic for the company's short-term stock value, but it was also honest in a way that corporate America rarely allowed. And if she was going to lose everything anyway, she might as well lose it by telling the truth. "I'll need documentation, everything we have on the Meridian acquisition and the accidents that followed. I already started pulling files. They'll be on your desk tomorrow morning." "Graham, why are you really doing this?" He stood, straightening his tie. "Because I've spent my entire career playing it safe, and I've watched you risk everything for something real. It made me realize I've never risked anything that mattered. This is me trying to be brave, even if it's borrowed courage." He headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you and Caleb are good together. He looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't give that up for people who wouldn't know real if it bit them." After Graham left, Vivian sat in her office staring at the city lights and thinking about risk and truth and the difference between winning and surviving. Then she called Caleb. "I need to see the settlement documents," she said when he answered. "From your accident. I know you signed an NDA, but I think there might be a way to void it. And I need to know what we're dealing with before I blow up my father's legacy." There was a long silence. "You're sure about this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." "Okay, I'll get you the files." "Caleb, whatever happens after this, thank you for being worth fighting for." "Right back at you." The documents arrived the next morning via encrypted email, and Vivian spent the weekend reviewing them with her legal team. What they found was worse than she'd expected, not just negligence in Caleb's case, but a pattern of safety violations across multiple acquisitions, all covered up with settlements and carefully worded NDAs. Workers who'd lost fingers, suffered chronic injuries, been exposed to toxic materials, all paid off in silence to protect the company's reputation. Her father hadn't just built an empire. He'd built it on broken bodies and buried secrets. On Monday morning, Vivian called a press conference. The turnout was massive. Every major business publication, financial networks, industry analysts who'd been predicting her downfall for weeks. They filled the conference room expecting to hear about her resignation. Instead, she stood at the podium with a stack of documents and a truth that would cost her everything. Good morning. I've called you here today to discuss a matter of corporate accountability. Over the past 2 weeks, there's been significant focus on my personal life and whether my relationship with a company employee represents a conflict of interest. I understand those concerns, but while everyone's been focused on that question, I've been investigating a different one. What responsibility does this company bear for injuries suffered by workers during acquisitions over the past 15 years? The room went silent. What I've found is troubling. Ashford Industries, under the leadership of my father, Richard Ashford, systematically covered up safety violations and worker injuries through the use of aggressive settlement tactics and non-disclosure agreements. We have documentation of at least 47 cases where workers were injured due to inadequate safety protocols during acquisition transitions, and those injuries were settled quietly to avoid legal liability and negative publicity. She pulled up the first slide, showing the list of acquisitions and corresponding injury reports. One of those workers was Caleb Hart, who suffered a career-ending injury 12 years ago during the Meridian Stageworks acquisition. He was a talented musician on track to study at Juilliard. The accident crushed his hand and ended that future. He was 24 years old. Cameras flashed. Journalists scribbled notes. Vivian saw Graham at the back of the room, nodding encouragement. I'm here today to announce that Ashford Industries will be conducting a full internal review of all acquisitions from the past 20 years, identifying any cases where workers were injured and inadequately compensated. We will be offering to void NDAs and provide additional compensation where appropriate. We will be implementing new safety protocols and oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again, and we will be establishing a fund for worker retraining and education, starting with a $10 million commitment. The questions came fast and furious. Vivian answered them honestly, not deflecting or corporate speaking her way through hard truths. Yes, this would be expensive. Yes, it would likely impact stock prices. Yes, her father had been directly responsible for many of these decisions. Yes, she understood this could result in lawsuits and regulatory investigations. And yes, the worker she'd mentioned, Caleb Hart, was the same person she was in a relationship with. But that wasn't why she was doing this. She was doing it because it was right. The press conference lasted 2 hours. By the time it was over, Vivian's phone was exploding with calls from board members, investors, and her father's lawyer. She ignored all of them and drove straight to Caleb's apartment. He answered the door looking shell-shocked. I just watched the press conference. Vivian, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Not just for you, for all of them. Everyone who got hurt and buried because it was cheaper than accountability. Your board is going to lose their minds. Probably, but at least they'll lose them over something that actually matters instead of who I'm sleeping with. Caleb pulled her inside and held her while she shook with adrenaline and fear and the strange exhilaration of having finally done something purely right without calculating the cost first. Maisie appeared in her school uniform, took one look at them and declared, "Group hug," before launching herself at both of them. They stood there in the cramped apartment entryway, 3 people who shouldn't have made sense together but somehow did, while outside the world started to process what Vivian had just unleashed. The fallout was immediate and intense. Stock prices dropped 15% in the first hour of trading. 2 board members called for her immediate resignation. But then something unexpected happened. Workers started coming forward, not just from Ashford Industries, but from across the industry, sharing stories of injuries covered up, safety concerns ignored, lives derailed by corporate negligence. Vivian's press conference had opened a door, and now people were walking through it. The story shifted from CEO's inappropriate relationship to major corporations' systemic worker abuse, and suddenly Vivian wasn't the villain anymore. She was the whistleblower. By Wednesday, 3 other companies had announced similar internal reviews. By Friday, Federal regulators had opened investigations into industry-wide safety practices. And by the following Tuesday, when the Ashford Industries Board met again, public opinion had shifted so dramatically that voting Vivian out would have been corporate suicide. Thomas Chen opened the meeting with an expression Vivian couldn't quite read. "Ms. Ashford, your press conference last week was unexpected." "I imagine so. It's cost the company significantly in stock value and opened us up to numerous legal liabilities." "I know. It's also generated more positive press coverage than we've had in 5 years and positioned us as industry leaders in corporate accountability. We've had 3 major investors reach out specifically to commend your courage in addressing past wrongdoing." Vivian hadn't expected that. "Oh. The board has voted 10-2 in favor of not only keeping you as CEO, but publicly supporting your reform initiatives. We're also voting to permanently remove Richard Ashford from any advisory capacity and to ban him from any future board positions." "What about the 2 who voted against me?" "They've resigned. Turns out they had their own safety violations they'd been covering up at their companies. Funny how that works." Margaret Williams, who'd questioned Vivian's judgment at the first board meeting, spoke up. "For what it's worth, Ms. Ashford, I was wrong about you. I thought you were too young, too emotional, too concerned with personal matters to handle this position. But what you did, exposing our failures, prioritizing people over profit, that's the kind of leadership we actually need, even if it makes us uncomfortable." Over the next few months, things slowly stabilized. The stock price recovered as the company's commitment to reform became clear. The worker compensation fund grew to $20 million as other board members contributed their own money, some perhaps motivated by genuine conscience, others probably by fear of their own skeletons being discovered. Caleb was among the first to receive additional compensation and a formal apology from the company, though he immediately donated most of the money to a music education program for underserved kids. Richard Ashford tried one last time to undermine Vivian, giving an interview where he painted himself as the victim of his ungrateful daughter's ambition. But by then, too many of his old secrets had come to light. The interview made him look bitter and out of touch, and even his former allies quietly distanced themselves. 6 months after the press conference, Miles Rowan called with an idea. "You know that song? The one Caleb finished? I've been thinking about it. About what it represents, 2 artists separated by tragedy, legacy carried forward through love and loss. That's a story worth sharing." "What are you suggesting?" "A concert, a fundraiser for the Worker Compensation Fund and the Music Education Program. Caleb plays the complete composition, we tell the story behind it, we make something beautiful out of all this pain. What do you think?" Vivian thought about it and realized it was perfect. A way to transform everything that had happened into something that mattered beyond corporate politics and family warfare. A way to honor James's memory and Caleb's talent and the possibility of creating meaning from loss. "I think it's brilliant. But you should ask Caleb. It's his decision." Caleb said yes immediately, though Vivian could see the fear in his eyes. He hadn't performed publicly since before the accident, hadn't put his music out in the world where it could be judged and found wanting. But he was ready to try. The concert was scheduled for a year to the day after the Christmas party where this all began. They held it in the Ashford Industries lobby, the same space where Vivian had first heard the melody that changed everything. The piano had been tuned and restored, the lobby transformed into an intimate concert venue with seating for 200 people. Tickets sold out in hours. The guest list included everyone from board members to maintenance staff, journalists who'd covered the story to workers who'd benefited from the compensation fund. Maisie sat in the front row wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, holding Professor Waddles for moral support. Vivian stood at the back, too nervous to sit, watching as Miles took the stage to introduce the evening. He told the story simply and honestly. James's fragment, his death, Caleb's completion of the song years later, the accident that crushed his hand, the long road to this moment. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then Caleb walked out, and Vivian's heart felt too big for her chest. He looked terrified and determined, his hands shaking slightly as he sat at the bench. He spoke directly to the audience, his voice quiet but clear. "I wrote this song for a friend who didn't live long enough to finish it himself. For years I thought it was private, something just between me and his memory. But then someone heard it, his eyes found Vivian's, and reminded me that music isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be shared, even when sharing it hurts. He placed his hands on the keys. This is for James, for everyone who's lost something they thought defined them, and for everyone who's found the courage to build something new from the pieces. The opening notes filled the lobby, James's melody pure and clear and achingly young. Then Caleb's composition took over, everything he'd poured into those bars, grief and rage and resilience and hope. The middle section built to that harsh dissonance, making the audience lean forward, making them feel the weight of dreams deferred and futures crushed. And then the transformation, the gradual softening into something that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. But this time, Caleb had added something new. In the final section, after the return to James's melody, he'd written an ending that hadn't existed before. It started as a simple variation on the opening theme, but then it grew into something entirely original, a conversation between what was lost and what was found, between grief and gratitude, between the boy who'd written those first bars and the man who'd carried them forward through 20 years and countless trials. It was a love song, Vivian realized, not romantic love, though that was part of it, but love is a larger force, the love that made you finish a dead friend's song, that made you keep going when everything fell apart, that made you risk everything for the possibility of connection. Love is an act of defiance against a world that wanted to reduce you to your worst moments and biggest failures. The final chord resonated through the lobby, and for a moment there was absolute silence. Then the applause started, building until it shook the marble floors and the glass walls and the carefully constructed corporate facade that had never been equipped to hold this much raw human emotion. Caleb stood and bowed, tears streaming down his face, and Maisie launched herself at the stage to hug him while the audience laughed and cried and applauded harder. Miles wiped his eyes. Graham, sitting near the front, stood and started a standing ovation that spread through the crowd until everyone was on their feet, and Vivian stood at the back of the room, watching the man she loved accept recognition for something beautiful he'd created from tragedy, and felt something settle in her chest. This was what winning actually looked like. Not perfect, not without cost, but real and true, and worth every sacrifice it had taken to get here. After the concert, there was a reception. Donors mingled with workers, executives talked to maintenance staff, and for one evening, the carefully maintained hierarchies of corporate life dissolved into something more human. Caleb was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him, to share their own stories of loss and persistence, to thank him for creating something that spoke to their experiences. Vivian watched from a distance, giving him space to shine without her presence complicating the narrative. But then Maisie appeared at her elbow. "You should be up there with him," she said seriously. "You're part of the story, too. This is his moment." "It's both of your moment. Come on." Maisie grabbed her hand and pulled her through the crowd until they reached Caleb. He saw them coming and his whole face lit up, that real smile that forgot to be sad. And he reached for Vivian's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "There you are," he said. "I was looking for you. You were surrounded by admirers. I didn't want to interrupt." "You could never interrupt." He pulled her close, not caring who saw, not worried about optics or professional boundaries or any of the things that had once seemed so important. "None of this happens without you. You know that, right? You hearing that song, you pushing me to share it, you fighting for the truth, even when it cost you everything, that's what made this possible. You did the hard part, the music, the courage to perform it. That was all you. It was us. All of it. Together." Maisie tugged on both their hands. "Can we get the fancy desserts now? I've been very patient, but there are little cakes with gold on them, and I really want to try one." They laughed and let her lead them to the dessert table. And for the rest of the evening, they were just 3 people at a party, eating cake and talking to strangers and existing in a space where titles and hierarchies didn't matter nearly as much as genuine connection. Later that night, after Maisie had fallen asleep in the car and been carried up to her room, after the reception had ended and the lobby had been cleared, Vivian and Caleb found themselves back at the piano. The building was quiet again, the way it had been that New Year's night when everything changed. "Play it again," Vivian said softly. "The new ending. I want to hear it without 200 people crying around us. Caleb sat at the bench and she settled beside him, their shoulders touching. He played the whole piece through, but this time when he reached the new ending, she joined in. Her technique was still rusty, her fingers stumbling over the more complex passages, but she knew enough to provide harmony to his melody. They played together, two people who'd found each other through music and loss and the stubborn refusal to let either define them. When the final chord faded, Caleb turned to her. I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I was scared. Scared of what it might cost, scared of losing you, scared of... I love you too, Vivian interrupted. And I'm scared too, but I'm more scared of not saying it, of letting fear make my decisions again. So where do we go from here? Vivian thought about the question honestly. She was still CEO, still facing challenges and skeptics who thought she was too young or too emotional or too willing to prioritize people over profit. Caleb was still working maintenance, though Miles had been making noise about him teaching at the music academy, about putting his talent to use in ways that honored both his past and his future. They were still navigating a relationship complicated by power differentials and public scrutiny, and a 7-year-old who had very strong opinions about bedtimes and vegetable consumption. But they were navigating it together, and that made all the difference. I think we keep doing this, she said finally. Keep being honest. Keep choosing truth over convenience. Keep building something real instead of something that just looks good on paper. That's a terrible business strategy. Good thing I'm dating someone who taught me that the best things in life don't make sense on paper. Caleb kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. People living their lives in all the messy, complicated ways that statistics and corporate reports could never fully capture. Inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds sat at a piano that had witnessed the beginning of their story and played music that honored both loss and love, grief and gratitude. Everything they'd survived to reach this moment. The ghost melody had become something living and real, a testament to the fact that beauty could grow from tragedy, that love could exist across impossible divides, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose truth even when lies were safer. And in the quiet of the empty lobby, with moonlight streaming through the glass walls and their hands moving together over the keys, Vivian Ashford and Caleb Hart wrote the ending to their song. Not perfect, not simple, but absolutely and completely true, which was the only kind of ending worth having.